Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Heterodox History. Today we're going to be discussing Elizabeth II, the modern monarchy, and what I provisionally called the Queen of the Ashes. Now, why am I doing this stream not on an original date, at midnight essentially? Well, obviously the Queen has been in the news recently regarding her, call to action supposedly regarding the recent Glasgow climate conference. And I've been thinking about this question for a long time as to what the Queen's legacy amounts to, what she ultimately represents. And then, of course, I saw that Marcus was chiming in on YouTube, and I thought, on Twitter, and we would, give this a go, try to get our opinions across. And I was reminded of a statement by Thomas More, St. Thomas More, which I covered on a previous stream with Columba. And the Latin phrase basically goes like this: qui tacet consentio videtur. And that essentially means he who is silent is taken to agree. And this is what I'm trying to do, contextualize the notion of political silence or inaction as a political stance and apply it to Elizabeth II, especially with regard to when she does finally speak and we arrive at something ridiculous like her wanting to push further the climate agenda. But when Thomas More was using this, it was a legalistic defense to maintain his life, his allegiance to his king, Henry VIII, and through this, he forced his opponents into a series of increasingly dubious acts to force a conviction, a illegitimate conviction, after which Thomas More finally breaks his silence, declares this whole notion of the detachment of the Church of England from Rome to be a complete charade, and that the organizations have no legitimacy in doing so, and therefore he ensures his martyrdom and his eternal fame. When Thomas More evoked this principle of silence as taken to meaning essentially to agree, it was to enable him to remain true to his convictions whilst shedding all culpability by eschewing his grand offices of state. Now, we're in an awkward position with the Queen because the Queen is not just an ordinary man like Thomas More. The Queen has transfigured herself into the physical embodiment of the state of the nation as the anointed leader or head of state. Basically, she, in Evolian terms, is beyond all of us. She is supernatural in a sense. And when I think about the concept of silence, I view it very much in the aura of a president and the area of a president officiating over a constitutional republic, by which she acknowledges and presides over the actions of a government. But this is again the quandary. Elizabeth II is not a president. Elizabeth II is a monarch, an anointed monarch, and therefore a transfigured monarch, and her loyalty is to something higher than just the constitutional settlement in which she finds herself in. Her loyalty is to her coronation oath and to God and to the principles of monarchism, not to mention the C of E. And so what I see as this policy of silence is worse than just claiming some sort of constitutional neutrality, which we'll get into. But it's more that she is giving tacit consent to all of the actions taken upon her governments. And of course, legally, there's a wonderful way around this, which is the idea of sovereign immunity. But as with everything to do with the Queen, that too is under assault. But the impression I'm left with is that she routinely, as a matter of political course, capitulates on all fronts, to the point that when we arrive at the position where the Queen is expected to be neutral or expected to not take an active stance on politics, that is a very modern position. That is not a position that has been maintained by monarchs at all, really, throughout history. And as we've seen in recent constitutional crises, it also creates a political vacuum. So in this sense, if we look at, say, for example, the Brexit crisis between 2018 and 2019, that was in many ways no different from the crisis under Henry VI, when we essentially had no monarch at the helm. And so I take the concept of the Latin phrase, he who is silent is taken to agree, qui tacet consentia videtur, and add it with ubi loqui debuit ac potuit, which means he ought to have spoken when he was able to. That the Queen was almost obligated in a position where she had to speak out. And when she chose to speak out nominally, it was on a policy of total irrelevance, which had almost universal backing from the elite, namely climate change. However, before we continue, there is something I want to talk about regarding the Queen's recent statement, so this doesn't sort of devolve into, rank punditry, so to speak, which I'm going to label Schrodinger's stance, essentially. That cat is both alive and dead as far as it pertains to the Queen. Either that recent remark, regarding climate change, was the Queen intimating her allegiance to the cathedral by pushing forward this very uncontroversial agenda, or the Queen was proffering a sarcastic remark that was recontextualized by the media. I'm not confident enough to say which position was correct. So as far as I'm concerned, it's one of these classic Queen Elizabeth II Schrodinger's positions. So regarding this, we're going to encounter frustratingly many of these. There are far more infamous examples, which is the notorious feud between Thatcher and the Queen in 1986, which was published in the Sunday Times, and which was demonstrated in its entirety on that ridiculous drama, The Queen, where the Queen basically says, I'm pro-miners, against unemployment, I'm pro-sanctions on South Africa, etc. Of course, the issue with that is that we do not know whether that is right or wrong. We have two people coming out, such as Ramphal and Shea, and of course Shea then comes out and says all of her comments were taken out of context. The same is true over her supporting Brexit, supposedly, and her 2007 criticism of Iraq and Afghanistan. There are many cases of this where the media runs with a story, and essentially we are not privy to knowing what the Queen's position is. However, there are not always times where that is the case. I mean, it's pretty obvious that the Queen, not only from Blair, but in terms of the impression she's left, supported the Belfast Agreement. And there is one thing in particular which I advise everyone who is listening to me now go and watch, which is the 2004 Christmas message. You can find it on YouTube, where the Queen explicitly endorses multiculturalism wrapped in the veneer of Christian fraternity, employing the language of diversity and inclusion to say diversity is our strength, essentially. And of course, Peter Hitchens was writing about this, back in the noughties, and basically said that this is making a complete nonsense over the notion that we have constitutional neutrality, that in reality we have a political Queen. And this is why I would like to...
Just as a quick point, AM, just because we mentioned it pre-show, it was years before Sadiq Khan would make the term common parlance as well, when the Queen used it.
About 12 years before Sadiq Khan became Mayor of London. So this has been going on for a long time. So what I'm illustrating is that this notion of constitutional neutrality is very convenient, and in many ways is a nonsense, because it basically can be contextualized as the Queen's broader pattern of behavior. Whereas Thomas More attempted and failed to give an outward impression of tacit consent, to remain true to his inner convictions and to his king, the Queen has characterized her tacit consent as something beyond that, something sacred, something representing constitutional neutrality, albeit the central purpose really is the preservation of the title of Queen, while betraying all notion of true monarchical rule, tradition, and constantly allying herself to forces which are hostile to monarchism and tradition, the forces of subversion, of eternal negation, and thereby what we're going to probably come to at the result of the end of this discussion is that the said title is thereby deprived of all but the most superficial and worthless meaning. Essentially, we have a monarchy which is pure theatre. There is nothing behind it. We are simply a government of form. And I want to contrast that with what the actual animated notion, the sacred notion of a monarch, really sort of entails, which is looking back at the Coronation Oath and the notion of sacred monarchy, because unlike many other sort of constitutional monarchies throughout Europe today, we are in this halfway house, essentially, where the Queen on paper has massive executive prerogatives, where she is a sacred monarchy in the sense that she undergoes the ritual anointing and is transfigured into something supernatural. We are not, living in like an Orleanist conception of the state where Louis Philippe goes around and says, I am king of the French, essentially. No, we have a sacred monarchy which has been tempered by hundreds and hundreds, if not a millennia long tradition of parliamentarianism versus monarchical rule. The irony, of course, being that we've ended up with a monarch who is in reality a president, and we have created a monarch through our parliamentary system, which at the moment is Boris Johnson. I thought a beautiful way to introduce this was by using a segment from Julius Evola from A Revolt Against the Modern World, where he talks about regality and the fundamental conception of what it means to be regal. Every traditional civilization is characterized by the presence of beings who, by virtue of their innate or acquired superiority over the human condition, embody within the temporal order the living and efficacious presence of a power that comes from above. One of these types of beings is the pontifex, according to the inner meaning of the word and according to the original value of the function that he exercised. Pontifex means builder of bridges, connecting the natural and supernatural dimensions. Moreover, the pontifex was traditionally identified with the king. Servius, a late 4th century commentator on Virgil's works, reports the custom of our ancestors was that the king should also be pontifex and priest. A saying of the Nordic tradition reads, "May our leader be our bridge." Thus, real monarchs were the steadfast personification of the life beyond ordinary life. Beneficial spiritual influences used to radiate upon the world of mortal beings from the mere presence of such men, from their pontifical mediation, from the power of the rites that were rendered efficacious by their power, and from the institutions of which they were the center. These influences permeated people's thoughts, intentions, and actions, ordering every aspect of their lives and constituting a fit foundation for luminous spiritual realizations. These influences also made propitious the general conditions for prosperity, health, and good fortune. In the world of tradition, the most important foundation of the authority and of the right of kings and chiefs, and the reason why they were obeyed, feared, and venerated, was essentially their transcendent and non-human quality. This quality was not artificial, but a powerful reality to be feared. The more people acknowledged the ontological rank of what was prior and superior to the visible and temporal dimension, the more such beings were invested with a natural and absolute sovereign power. And this isn't just, Evola's, idle fantasy. This is encapsulated in the coronation rituals, which I've got up here on the image. Marcus, is there anything you want to say on the nature of divine monarchy?
You've pretty much canvassed how one could define it. What I would say is that interesting how Evola used the word Pontifex Maximus, because I'm obviously well aware of the term, but I never actually thought of it as the etymology of it being ponte, which you're right, is the Latin word for bridge, and that the sort of, you might say, the esoteric notion of it is the bridge between sort of the spiritual world and the physical world, as you described, and that should reside in kingship. I think that's a very interesting take from Evola. And if you look at what Evola's potentially writing about, it's perhaps the transformation of Rome from the Principate to the Dominate, and then with the arrival of Constantine, with the transition to Christianity, it makes this sort of new concept of divine right that sort of arises in Western Europe in the feudal period. And really, on the subject of the Windsors and the British monarchy, we are talking on the last residue of that notion. And this is, and despite all the grandeur of that legacy and of the vast weight of history that rests on that, this is where the dynasty has ended up. This is where the notion of kingship has ended up in our time. It's fallen very far from its heights. I'll say that much.
So I'll just thank you for that, Marcus. I'll just quickly go over the coronation oath. It's not very long. The Archbishop of Canterbury goes to Elizabeth and asks, "Will you solemnly promise and swear to govern the peoples of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Union of South Africa, and at this time also included Pakistan and Ceylon, and of your possessions and other territories, to any of them belonging or pertaining according to their respective laws and customs?" Of course, the Queen then swears, "I do." "Will your power cause law and justice in mercy to be executed in all your judgments?" Of course, the Queen responds, "I do." "Will you, to the utmost of your power, maintain the laws of God and the true profession of the gospel?" "Will you, to the utmost of your power, maintain in the United Kingdom the Protestant Reformed religion established by law?" "Will you maintain and preserve inviolable the settlement of the Church of England and the doctrine, worship, discipline, and government thereof, as by law established in England? And will you preserve unto the bishops and clergy and of England, and to the churches these committed to their charge, all such rights and privileges, as by law do or shall they appertain to them or any of them," etc. Then proceeds the anointment with the chrism. And again, this is the sacred, and when looking at the coronation footage in 1953, the notion of the sanctity of the ceremony was, of course, obscured by the fact that the coronation itself, the investiture and the crowning, was filmed but the Holy Eucharist and the chrism anointment of the monarch was, of course, concealed, because the whole notion of it is sacred, dating back to the anointment of Solomon by, by Nathan and Zadok, essentially, transfiguring the monarch into the said supernatural entity. So Evola is describing something which is necessarily intrinsic not only to monarchy in general, but to the monarch as personified by Elizabeth II. And then we have the proceeding to the investment and the coronation, and of course the homage by which all the leading peers of the realm proceed to offer fealty, essentially. Now, going back to Evola's comment about the ruler, the king, or in this case, the queen as pontifex, in the case of the English monarchy or the British monarchy, that is more true, because not only is the queen the head of state, but she's also head of the established religion. In that sense, she is both priest and magistrate. She governs over the temporal and spiritual realms. And of course, this is something which is embodied in her namesake, Elizabeth I. But what I would like to present is that Elizabeth I, despite being the said namesake of Elizabeth II, is probably the most juxtaposed personality in terms of recognizing this, in terms of everything that Elizabeth I represents versus everything Elizabeth II represents. But of course, I'm just talking about the sacramental elements of the monarchy that make it sacred, and that make it essentially sacred. But of course, we have to weigh that against what is essentially 800 years of the advance of Parliament. Of course, this goes back to Magna Carta, even though I would argue that Magna Carta isn't such a direct precedent as a lot of people imagine, nor would I argue that Magna Carta created a teleology which arrived in liberal democracy. There are other more concrete examples one can point to, such as Edward III creating the Model Parliament, 1295. And of course, then after that, we have the supremacy, of course, with Henry VIII. We have the Act of Uniformity. We have the Elizabeth creating herself as the supreme governor of the Church of England, all of these facts. And in theory, this is to create a form of monarchical absolutism, essentially. But of course, then history changes. We have the English Civil War, we have the rise of Cromwell, we have the interregnum, we have the martyrdom and deposition of Charles I. We have the brief restoration under what can say, our last successful absolutist king, who was Charles II. And then, of course, we have the unsuccessful reign of James II, who we've chronicled quite extensively on this channel. The result of his unsuccessful reign was, of course, the Glorious Revolution. And from here on out, the nature of monarchy in England changes forever, essentially. We have the Bill of Rights and we have the Claim of Right. And what the Claim of Right in particular does is that it provides for a redress of all grievances and for the attending strengthening, preserving of the laws of Parliament and the right to have freedom of speech within said Parliament and to allow to be sit frequently. Essentially, it's establishing Parliament as a permanent institution which isn't bound, by the arbitrary whims of a monarch, so to speak. But combined with that, you also have the Act of Settlement, which bars non-Protestants from inheriting the throne. Because despite, what we mentioned in the Coronation Oath, which is this adhesion to the notion of a Protestant religion. This is very much again the result of the Glorious Revolution, because prior to then, England had gone through a succession of rulers of different religions, and the nation kept switching along with the religion, so to speak, even though we have the established Church of England, and that was still the case under James II. So with the Act of Settlement, we bar Catholics from the succession, and you can say we import a very unassuming and unexciting series of monarchs, the Georgian dynasty. And this also is another facet we need to talk about, which is the monarch willfully giving away prerogatives and power during this period. So the first monarch post-Glorious Revolution was William III. And William III, of course, had come from the Netherlands. He'd been a stadtholder, as basically an executive president, albeit with a bit of hereditary tinge to it. And he had very little interest in terms of organizing the domestic affairs of his realm. He basically wanted to control foreign policy. And this is something which is also strengthened when you have the importation of the electors of Hanover as the nominal kings of now Great Britain, because after 1707 you have, of course, the Act of Union. The effect of all of these monarchs, the Georgian monarchs and the monarchs of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, their monarchs of Windsor, is I think they are united in how unexceptional they are. And this also is a boon, essentially, for the powers of Parliament, is that you have essentially neutered any attempt from a monarch, such as, a Jacobite monarch, advocating for a true sense of absolutism, from acting as a brake on the system, which is becoming ever more an oligarchy, which will then transition into a representative democracy. So this is the peculiar instance that we arrive at with our monarchy, which is we have this sacred monarchy with these constitutional trappings, and a constitution which is marred essentially by precedent. All of this is precedential. We don't have a system where, at one point a monarch created a constitution and declared that we are now a constitutional democratic state. This is a process which has been going on for hundreds of years. And when we're talking about the modern monarchy, I'm going to refer directly to George V, George VI, and Elizabeth II. Why those two monarchs? Because Elizabeth II herself refers to her grandfather and her father as the monarchs whose legacy she basically wanted to embody. And this is where we get to, you can say, the juiciest segment of this conversation, which is the surrender of prerogative under the modern monarchy, despite all of this grand trapping which we've elucidated here. Is there anything you want to say, Marcus, on what I've characterized about the nature of the English monarchy up until 1910, essentially?
No, you've covered everything. I really have very little to add, but this is probably, as you might say, colonial, where I can probably make some input here. So, by all means, let's proceed to the next slide.
Yes, this is the principal reason, among other things, why I wanted such a wonderful and erudite figure such as Marcus to come on, because a lot of, I don't know why, but traditionally, when you see documentaries of the Queen, all of which are pretty awful, it always tends to be characterized within a very Anglo-centric or British-centric way. Occasionally there's reference, or quite a lot of reference, to Scotland, but I'm seeing the monarch not just the monarch of England, but as the monarch of all the Commonwealth realms, and what the implication of that is, and the legacy of empire, essentially. So what I'm going to go through with the surrender of prerogatives is not just the effect on the British Constitution, but on the effect of the constitutions of essentially everywhere where the monarchy is essentially ruled over, and to explain that this is not just an English phenomenon, this is a global phenomenon. Of course, on the left image I have here, I have one of my favorite politicians, Pierre Trudeau, the father of the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who of course led this process in Canada during the 70s and 80s. I think a good place to start is, right at the beginning of the reign of George V, because it sets the tempo of what is going to happen over the next 100 or so years, which is that George V inherits the throne during the midst of a constitutional crisis. This crisis is over Lloyd George wanting to push through a people's budget, which would essentially, attack the fundamental property rights of the landed aristocracy in England. So the House of Lords, which still had the, right of absolute veto on a budget, vetoed this budget, and this caused a constitutional catastrophe, because essentially now the government could not pass a budget. Now, the hero of this narrative, essentially from the weak historical point of view, is George V. Because George V comes in and he offers, as the arbiter of the Constitution, a constitutional solution for this, which is have an election and keep producing elections in which you can have a majority. And I will force, essentially, the appointment of partisan lords in the upper house to force through these measures. And of course, this is what happened. Essentially, what George V established was a democratic mechanism rather than a monarchical mechanism in order to get a progressive budget through, essentially. When the House of Lords were, of course, Lloyd George won, albeit in coalition with Irish Home Rule and Labour, when the Lords were faced with that proposal, they instead accepted the Parliamentary Reform Act of 1910, in which they basically surrendered their right to basically definitively veto any legislation, but especially the budget. It basically removed the House of Lords as a major political power in British politics moving forward. And the instigator of that policy was none other than a king, George V. In terms of how this continues, of course, we used to be the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, not just the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So in 1922, we see the breakup of Ireland. Again, the sundering of a realm, but not quite, because the Free State of Ireland was still ruled over by a king. In 1931, we have the Statute of Westminster, and this is why I wanted to get Marcus's interpretation and the broader Commonwealth view. Building upon a series of imperial conferences and the Balfour Declaration a few years earlier, all Dominion parliaments were, in theory, created equal and independent. Their sole source of unity was through their loyalty to the crown. Of course, Marcus will probably tell me that in Australia, this took up until the 1980s for it to finally process, along with the same thing happened in Canada. But of course, what was the effect of this? When Eamon de Valera was elected in Ireland, he essentially just abolished the oath of allegiance, the idea that one has to pay homage to the monarch. And what did the Privy Council do? It failed to uphold monarchical privilege every single time. So basically, Ireland from 1937 until 1949 was a de facto republic until it finally passed and became the Republic of Ireland in 1949. So Ireland is one of those key examples where we see a failure of the monarch's council, in this case it would be George VI, to uphold his royal prerogatives, and so therefore abandoning essentially one of his kingdoms. In terms, of course, this simply accelerates from then on. The Indian Empire is transformed into a dominion, the former British Raj, and then, of course, within 3 years, they get rid of the monarch again, and India becomes a republic. And this is, I think, a good time to get back to England, essentially what is going on here constitutionally, which is what was the political status of Queen Elizabeth upon her succession, essentially. Well, contrary to this idea that, the Queen is neutral and has always stood above politics, the monarch traditionally has always appointed a prime minister based on advice, essentially. So constitutionally, the monarch holds the right to dissolve parliament, to hold elections, and to appoint a government, essentially. And the Queen, through 1956 and 1963, was placed in an awkward position where she was directly responsible for the appointment of Harold Macmillan, albeit on the advice of the Conservatives, and of Alec Douglas Hume, much to the chagrin of many Republicans back in the 1960s. And this issue was eventually resolved through a Conservative election system, but nevertheless, the Queen directly involved to appoint her own prime ministers throughout the 1950s, something which everyone seems to forget. And if it's okay, I want to sort of talk about the complete about turn, which is the Australian constitutional crisis, Marcus. Would you like to tell us a bit about that and what the implications were basically for the monarchy in Australia thereafter? Marcus? Oh dear, we've lost Marcus. Okay, well, until Marcus comes back, I'll try and give a little overview of this. Essentially, Australia had a constitutional crisis in 1975, during which the Governor General, who is essentially the ambassador of the Queen abroad, basically is a more diminutive title of a viceroy, tried to resolve a constitutional crisis in which essentially the upper house of Australia was blocking proposals from the lower house. The solution of John Kerr, the then Governor General, was to dismiss the Labour Prime Minister Whitlam and hold new elections. Of course, this was very controversial and it caused a major constitutional crisis. The effect of that, obviously, is that the Queen appoints the Governor General. In theory, the Governor General is the representative of the Queen. So when the Queen was asked for her direct intervention on this, she chose to not intervene at all. She chose to abandon her own representative, John Kerr. And sorry, Marcus, would you like to come back in to comment on what I've been saying about Australia?
Oh no, well, just since you're mid blow, keep going. But if you want me to chime in, I can. So, because you're talking about John Kerr and the Whitlam government, and the fact that there was absolutely no upholding of monarchical duties pertaining to Australia.
Yeah, well, the Queen basically abandoned them. She basically
Mm,
left her own Governor General with the responsibility for it, despite the fact that his own authority, his legitimacy, comes from the Queen. And this is again
exactly.
the complete about turn from the appointments of the 1950s and 1960s. After I think the backlash of the appointment of elect Douglas Hume, it almost seems again that that was used as a pretext to completely abandon. I mean, even in a ceremonial republic, say for example Germany or Greece or whatever, the role of the president, even if he's not supposed to pronounce on individual matters of policy or appear partisan politically one way or the other, albeit most of them are members of political parties, they often have a constitutional function whenever there's a crisis to resolve it, essentially. And this is something which I think the Queen again represents a political vacuum in a way that would be, fatal in an earlier sort of more unstable time. But during this period, the Queen offered nothing in terms of constitutional arbitration, leaving her Governor General to take up the slack, and basically he had to resign shortly after. And from what I gather, because it was directed against a Labour Prime Minister, namely Whitlam, it's led to a huge rise of Australian republicanism as a result.
Just on the point too, in the context of this particular situation as well, because same as Britain, but rather than calling it the House of Lords, we just simply have the upper house and lower house, and it was the upper house which had a Liberal Party, aka Australian Tory majority, and they blocked supply. So basically, the Labor government was unable to pass a budget of any kind. So, in not too dissimilar scenario to the George V scenario that you're describing from 1910, again, it's this roadblock between the two houses of parliament and an inability for the government to continue, day-to-day business. And whenever the Queen is called upon, or the monarch, in this case the Queen, is called upon to fulfill a royal duty, the duties are not in any way lived up to whatsoever.
I know it's an awful predicament you're in. Basically, George V acted upon his constitutional role, but did so in a way which further advanced democracy. Again, I'm talking again about the conception of monarchy, and again, this has proved disastrous for the ultimate implications for monarchy. And in Australia, this is something more than that, which is the fundamental dereliction of duty, where she's no longer the constitutional arbiter facilitating this. She is basically politically absent, and the result of this is that other people need to take up the slack. And this is something which we'll talk to a lot when it comes to the constitutional crisis revolving around Brexit.
And you raise a good point too, that it became a lightning rod ever after for Australian republicanism, and Whitlam's acolytes, his political acolytes, and his ideological descendants forever used the constitutional crisis of his government as this sort of standard to rally around for the pro-Republican argument. And just for you, I don't know if you know this, or for your audience, not that I'm a fan of Whitlam in any way whatsoever from a political standpoint, but the man actually had a wonderful turn of phrase. And there's a quote by him, I think it was when he walked out of Parliament for the last time and he addressed the media. And he said, "Well, may we say God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor General." And when you think about how Robert Kerr was essentially left in complete political isolation, despite being confronted with the toughest of tasks for a Governor General to handle, those words actually sort of ring both ways for left and for right wing, if you think about it, because the left would take that statement literally as in, oh, well, God save the Governor General because he's buggered up my favorite government. But inversely, for those of us from the, you might say, monarchical standpoint of the right wing, it's like, well, no, actually, the Governor General was completely abandoned by his monarch, whom he's purportedly meant to represent in the colonies, or in this case, in the periphery of the Commonwealth. He's completely isolated, and the Queen is not fulfilling her royal duties. So what do you make of that?
Exactly. I think it goes further than that. What's the implications of him saying God save the Queen? Why do certain left-wing figures, in this case we're moving on to Pierre Trudeau and Blair, do little to advance the actual cause of republicanism while removing all the actual symbols associated with monarchy? I think is this notion that, again, the monarch can be counted on to basically acquiesce to this every single time. And this is moving into the crux of, I guess, my damning argument against Elizabeth II, albeit this has to be contextualized within the broader implications of monarchy, and that this simply represents, you can almost say, the end of the road. In the 1970s, Pierre Trudeau begins removing various symbols of royalty. And of course, this leads to the final patriation of Canada in 1982. You have superficial elements such as Dominion Day being rebranded as Canada Day, essentially. And then we have weird stories regarding Pierre Trudeau, such as him sliding down the banisters at Buckingham Palace, i.e. supposed to indicate basically no respect for the Queen whatsoever. But nevertheless, the final implication of the patriation was that the Queen was basically allowed to keep her nominal prerogatives as the Queen of Canada. So what we're basically seeing is that no longer we're seeing the complete breakup of the empire. Not only is the Queen basically organized over one single government which is officiating over the empire, but the legacy of her predecessors, the legacy of the Westminster Statute going back to 1931, is that now the Queen is basically the figurehead in a personal union with this ever burgeoning series of monarchies, which will become, of course, have already at this point become the Commonwealth. I mentioned earlier about this idea of essentially immunity, the idea that the Queen is not essentially bound by the actions of her government, essentially sovereign immunity. And this carries, beyond the fact that the monarch is not supposed to be treated in the same manner, in terms of the same proceedings, taxation being, one clean example. In 1993, the Queen was made to pay income taxes, again, undermining the notion that there is such a thing as sovereign immunity, and we're left in this absurd position where the Queen, who is the head of government, who again is having to partake, again being made by a conservative government, in this, you can say, openly egalitarian exercise of paying taxes, when despite the fact that her income comes predominantly from the civil list already from the government, seems redundant. And again, it's just, you can almost say, a demonstration of this representation of egalitarianism being thrust upon the Queen. And of course, this only rapidly accelerates with 1997 and Blair. We'll get to Diana and the social implications. Sorry,
just a sec. I am just on the point about the income tax. That there is probably the first demonstration of a successive incidents like this thereafter that are demonstrative of this modernist obsession with tokenism. Like you say, if you're on the public list and the income of the royal family sort of comes from the government, is derived from the government and its estates and some combination of, taxing that money is almost entirely redundant, like you say. So for there to be a tax placed on that is pure tokenism. It is a pure demonstration of public egalitarianism, as you have rightly said, for no purposes other than to sort of almost, how can I say, for those of us who think as we do, it really is just demonstration of the march of an ideology in one direction, like the ratchet turns one way. And this is just a public demonstration of that, as an example.
Yes, precisely, and I completely agree with that. And of course, this is the slippery slope with but again, we're moving beyond constitutionalism, because just to emphasize my point, when we're talking about constitutional neutrality, again, the fundamental conception of monarchy is that the idea of monarchy, real monarchy, is in some way beyond that of mortal man. It's in some way divine. When the monarch is neutral, what we mean is that the monarch is not supposed to prioritize one group or one faction over the other. He is supposed to transcend factionalism and represent the nation as a whole, as the spiritual embodiment of said nation. So, for example, in a parliamentary setting, this would be not favoring the clergy or the nobility or the third estate, essentially. The idea is that, especially with a parliament, with the model parliament as it was originally conceived, is that all of these feudal functionaries are coming together and they are offering their due to their liege, to their sovereign, essentially, who governs in the interest of all of them. It is not, again, this modern conception where the Queen doesn't speak on policy issues for fear of offending one partisan faction or another. She is supposed to transcend that in a way where she espouses the ideas of the eternal customs of the nation. Of course, the parody of which democratic government becomes is that the notion of ancient customs or ancient law is changed on a daily basis, and Parliament can change the fundamental nature of everything, essentially what life is, what is the nature of our religious settlement, with the Queen just giving, nothing more than, a gentle nod to all of these procedures, as monarchy is basically driven down into, I'm not even really sure how to describe it at this point, but of course with Blair, David Starkey basically refers to 1952 to 1997 as the era in which the Queen wanted to rule in the manner of her father and the grandfather. And of course, Peter Hitchens draws on this as well, which is the beginning of abolition of Britain. All of these factors have already, of course, contributed to this abolition of Britain. Of course, Tony Blair, or Anthony Blair, which I've got listed here to not offend Mr. D, represents that final abolition. And this comes at the beginning of Tony Blair's ascent into power with the death of Princess Diana. The result of the death of Princess Diana basically demonstrated that the nation did not understand what the monarch was essentially supposed to represent, in the fact that they expected the monarch to partake in procedures and rituals which were more akin to an American celebrity, essentially, or a preening politician. And the effect of this is that Blair came in supposedly as the savior of the monarchy to bring her down and show this grand demonstration of commiseration before this public, you can almost say obscene commiseration, which is again preening as a mere politician, as opposed to remaining neutral and above all this sort of thing. Now, my hypothesis essentially thereafter is that the Queen essentially formed an alliance with Blair. Blair was in such a powerful position in 1997 that had he wanted to, he potentially could have abolished the monarchy, especially as the 1990s was the low point in terms of the Queen's popularity. But, stemming from the example we've demonstrated with Pierre Trudeau, Blair instead went for this policy of the elimination of the symbols and the substance of monarchy. So already we've had the Statute of Westminster, we've had the devolution of the dominions. Now we're having devolution within Britain. So Wales and Scotland will be essentially devolved, and the fundamental constitutional nature of the country will change forever. Beyond that, of course, we have the Good Friday Agreement. And this is, again, why I point to the political pragmatism of selective silence regarding the Queen. Because when we talk about the Queen, Blair basically wanting the Queen to espouse some form of gratitude for the Good Friday Agreement, this has to be seen within a very specific political context, which is that the Queen's uncle by law, the adopted uncle of Prince Philip, Lord Mountbatten, was of course assassinated by the IRA. I think it was in 1979, and the effect of the Queen giving the stamp to what could be seen, by many as a very lenient settlement to the IRA, I think was a very conscious decision by Blair to, again, mend that specific gap where basically the right will be seen as irreconcilable to the IRA. Well, if the Queen, who has been personally connected to the IRA terrorism, is seen to turn the other cheek and offer, consolation and forgiveness, then that'll go a long way to selling this to the public. And that's what I mean by this almost Faustian pact, whereby the Queen is there to legitimize rather than simply preside over it in a neutral fashion, the Blair administration. Of course, I've already mentioned Blair's policy regarding diversity in 2004, where the Queen basically came out in 2004 and said diversity is our strength. But this, of course, goes beyond that, because we've already mentioned this conversation begins in 1910 with House of Lords reform, and it ends with House of Lords reform, because the Queen did nothing while Tony Blair, again, fundamentally altered the nature of the Constitution, removed the idea, again, apart from a select token of hereditary peers, the Lords Spiritual, etc. The remainder of the Lords was emptied and was basically replaced by political appointees, the majority of which were, of course, Blair appointees, cronyism en masse in a way that Lloyd George had attempted but could only dream of achieving.
Also, the establishment of the Supreme Court, which was very much unprecedented in Great Britain as well, and circumvented much of your established laws in the country.
Well, yes, this is again what is Blair's ultimate achievement here? Well, the function of judicial review had basically been the function of the law lords within the House of Lords. And what we're seeing with the Supreme Court is Blair consciously trying to adopt either American or continental constitutional procedures. I mean, one of the ironies, of course, is that the idea of the separation of powers comes from a misreading of our Constitution by Montesquieu. And of course, it's the legacy of that misinterpretation that, inspired the American revolutionaries to create their own constitution. But again, it's the idea of the separate judiciary reviewing the idea of the Constitution. Well, on the face of it, it's also absurd, because because we have an unwritten constitution which is based so much on the idea of precedent again. And this is why I'll get into the incredibly controversial decision when it comes to the 2019 prorogation. But again, it's, you can say, the Americanization of this constitution, hollowing out all aspects of tradition within our constitution to appease some sort of, again, foreign facsimile of what it means to have a government. The other thing I want to get into, I've mentioned one of the Queen's Schrodinger stances, which was her supposed, opposition to Afghanistan and Iraq. Of course, Tony Blair got us involved in Afghanistan and Iraq, and as per the subsequent Levinson inquiry, he had intentionally misled the public, he misled Parliament, and we can assume misled the Queen in terms of basically forcing her hand on that proposal. If we are to believe the Schrodinger stance, take with a grain of salt regarding the Queen's opposition to the war, I think this again demonstrates the Queen's utter impotence in the face of Blair, that Blair could achieve this basically without the Queen's approval, without the Queen's consent, and basically wage wars of aggression. As we're going back right to the beginning of the Glorious Revolution, what was surrendered? It wasn't the right of the monarch to represent the nation in terms of foreign affairs and in terms of war. Essentially, the monarch has that function. The monarch is the supreme commander of our armed forces. The monarch is a field marshal. And the fact that, again, Blair was so effortlessly able to circumvent this to his own agenda, completely bypassing the Queen, again, demonstrates, unfortunately, the complete impotence of the Queen. Whether, again, she supported that or do not support that, it's simply, as of now, a matter of conjecture. It's not something I've gone into extensively to be able to verify one way or the other. But then, of course, this continues into a conservative government, because I think the contention here is that even though we elected a conservative government, which formed a coalition under Cameron, ever since 1997, we've still been living essentially in the era of Blair. We have been united by the 1701 Act of Settlement. Of course, as a Catholic, I'm in the position where objectively I'm defending the notion that what the monarch came to represent from the 1700s all the way up until the new millennia is this idea that the Protestant religion has to be defended. Well, of course, the Perth Agreement, basically of all the Commonwealth nations, undoes the Royal Marriage Act, and it also undoes male preference primogeniture in the form of absolute primogeniture, i.e. a woman will inherit instead of a man if she is the firstborn. Now, again, because this was quickly rushed through, because Kate Middleton, I believe, this was essentially in anticipation of the marriage of Kate Middleton and whether she would, produce a girl or a boy, that the monarch and all the governments were so anxious to not be forced into a situation where they would have to, again, fight on the grounds of egalitarianism, that they preemptively forced through a situation to abolish the ancient succession, the ancient rules of succession, in order to produce something which seemingly, again, like the income tax, was seemingly more egalitarian. And of course, it proved to be redundant because the firstborn of Kate and William was, of course, a boy. You've said in the private chat, Marcus, you want to talk a bit about Rhodesia. If it's possible, I want to come back to Rhodesia at the end of this discussion because it pertains to the Queen and the Commonwealth, if that's all right. But before we move on to the constitutional crisis, is there anything more you want to say regarding anything what I've said, really?
Little aside from we obviously talk a lot about Blair in our circles, and Blair's obviously come up a lot in recent times, and it's sort of interesting that despite Blair having stepped away when his popularity really plummeted, when the public started to cotton on as to how bad the Iraq War was and and how little was to be gained and the sheer destruction, which a lot of people still haven't quite gauged. I mean, the war in Iraq has displaced hundreds of thousands of people, and tens of thousands, if not more, have died since the West was engaged in Iraq from 2004, I think, till when did the West leave Iraq? Would it be maybe 4 or 5 years ago? I can't
quite remember, but it was relatively recently.
Relatively recently, and of course, Afghanistan just collapsed this year. We already talked about it a couple of months ago, but nonetheless, that despite being this sort of new labor force and this sort of standard bearer of the new left, not only in Britain but in the West, broadly speaking, Tony Blair was one of the most enthusiastic drum beaters for war, and was very glad to throw Britain into the
There's
mix
something
in
I
both
just want to
Iraq
highlight quickly,
and
which is,
Afghanistan.
AA is very emphatically saying that, of course, despite the Iraq War, 2 years afterwards, Blair, of course, won yet another election.
Yes, that's very true. No, I know that. Yes,
Just
but
to reiterate that, so for our audience.
of course, but his popularity did tail off towards
Oh
the end,
yes, absolutely, yeah.
which is why he handed over to Gordon Brown, who Jeremy Clarkson did call the one-eyed Scottish idiot, which I think is quite suiting. But yeah, like you've said, despite then, the Tories winning government with a coalition between Cameron and Clegg of the Lib Dems, it almost seems like Blair never left, and that Blair actually, in some ways, sort of, despite having not been prime minister and not himself actually sitting within the British Parliament, has become more powerful out of it, and in fact exerts more control, just quiet control, to the extent where, in the midst of, shall we say, present day circumstances, in sort of air quotes, there's chit chat about him potentially making a political comeback. Now, I've heard AA emphasize this in the chat. He's an evil genius of monumental capability. And he demonstrated that when he won power, and he's demonstrated it ever since. It's just something to be said about Blair. He's probably the most fiendishly clever leftist on the planet in my mind.
But again, but again, it's not a precedent which he himself set. The precedent had been set by others in the Commonwealth. Of course, this left-wing recontextualization, one could argue, of the monarchy to make the monarchy essentially a progressive ally. As ridiculous as that sounds, and
the fact that he was able to sort of flip it, like you say, like he's able to put the Queen into this position almost like a fait accompli. It's astonishing, his acumen to have accomplished that.
Precisely. And this gets into, again, because the conversation is also about political neutrality, silence and inaction. The result of this silence and inaction, of course, was, for people who don't know, of course, England, voted to leave the European Union Britain voted to leave the European Union in 2016. We then got a new prime minister after David Cameron resigned very abruptly, Theresa May. In 2017, Theresa May held one of the most bizarre elections I've ever witnessed, in which she basically, Jeremy Corbyn, who was her opponent, basically promised everything, and she ended up being stigmatized for basically her elderly tax. And as a result of it, she held that election to strengthen her position, and she actually ended up losing seats. The result of the next 2 years, until we had the subsequent election with Boris Johnson, was that we had a Conservative Party which was completely divided, with pro-Remain politicians and Brexit politicians, and even together they couldn't muster a majority had the party been united around this common issue.
And fundamentally non-conservative.
Yes, and fundamentally non-conservative. So the bizarre situation we're in now is that Theresa May wants desperately to resolve the Brexit situation, but there is no constitutional mechanism for her to resolve said issue. And she can't hold another election again because essentially the Conservative Party knows that it'll be pointless and she may lose even more seats. So rather than the Conservatives solving this issue quickly in-house, as they eventually had to do 2 years later down the line, we were left in this bizarre situation where it wasn't the Queen who intervened to offer a constitutional solution. It was John Bercow, the, in hindsight, very partisan, supposedly conservative speaker, who ended up basically supporting Parliament in all of its endeavours, essentially to hamstring the government and offer, basically a backdoor proposal for a second referendum. What I'm basically illustrating is that in this vacuum, you enter basically, a non-entity such as John Bercow rises to fill that vacuum, which should be held by the supreme constitutional arbiter, namely the Queen. And this again is the actual political ramifications of essentially non-intervention, as the Queen represents. The Queen essentially can maintain this policy of non-intervention if there is some sort of power there to fill that vacuum. And this, again, as we look to the Wars of the Roses, look to more ancient examples. Why did England devolve into the Wars of the Roses? Because Henry VI failed to provide leadership in the Hundred Years' War, which ended in a complete calamity. And he failed to provide leadership in the face of the claims, the reasserted claims of Richard, Duke of York. As a result of that, you were left with two potential powers that could, govern Britain. One was the Yorkist family, of course, and one was the Lancastrian cause under his wife, Margaret of Anjou. Both were claiming authority because the king no longer exercised any actual executive authority. When we relate that to the Queen essentially, again, we're left in a weird situation where we have this conflict between one faction, which is John Bercow and the anti-Brexit parliamentarians, and the dwindling pro-Brexit faction under Theresa May, which is also incredibly disgruntled with Theresa May's concessions regarding Brexit. So we were left with a constitutional crisis, which leads us to the prorogation situation. And to my mind, the prorogation is virtually all but forgotten, now considering subsequent events. But it's one of the most, I would say, shameful things I've ever sort of witnessed. When, of course, the Conservatives held an event which was basically called a prorogation, by which they wanted to stop Parliament sitting. So Parliament, in theory, again, wouldn't be ramming through amendments or trying to frustrate the passage of a Brexit Act, essentially. The result of this, of course, was that a series of campaigners, NGOs, and the Scottish government went to the newly created Supreme Court, which again is the creation of the Faustian pact with Blairism. And Lady Hale, who I've got on the right, of course, was the head of the Supreme Court back in 2019, used an incredibly obscure case regarding the proclamations of 1611 to claim that the judiciary had the right to circumvent royal prerogatives, and contextualizing this within this conception that England is a democratic nation and the idea that Parliament is ultimately sovereign over the monarch. They claimed this incredible, I would argue, usurpation of judicial power over the Queen, where now the Supreme Court and not the monarch was the supreme arbiter of the Constitution. The irony, of course, is that if you look at the ancient 1611 case of proclamations, it argued intrinsically that the monarch had the right to enforce the law. If you remember, I'm not sure if anyone remembers this, the language which was used by Lady Hale, which was that the prorogation never happened. Because it did not have legal standing, it could never happen. If you were arguing the spirit of that case of proclamations, one would have recommended to the monarch to amend her mistake, essentially, that she had acted beyond her authority. But it was the fact that Lady Hale took upon herself, with the unanimous consent of the Supreme Court, to declare that the Queen had never had that authority. They had the authority. We see a complete usurpation of that power. So you can almost say it's fitting that after 2 years of constitutional bedlam, after this constant series of political inaction, a new organization which was created as a result of Blair's alliance with a now progressive monarchy, then creates a situation where all these sort of residue of her prerogatives is finally taken away. And of course, this has happened, you can say, more definitively and more dramatically in other European countries. This isn't something unique to Britain. Of course, in the 1970s, if anyone knows anything about Sweden, when the Bernadottes came in after Napoleon, Jean Bernadotte essentially ruled Sweden as an absolute monarch. And in theory, the monarch had absolute power. And the last time a monarch actually wielded significant power and influence was during the long reign of Gustav V, the king who presided over Sweden's neutrality during World War II. His son, basically as a result of, again, prompting of another social democratic government, permitted the removal of all of his royal prerogatives, essentially, between 1971 and 1975. But again, this is almost more dramatic than that, in that it came across as a direct usurpation by a newly created authority as a result of this alliance with Tony Blair. However, there is a little bit of a silver lining, because again, going back to the first point I made, which is he who is silent is taken to agree. He ought to have spoken when he was able to, which is something I've been thinking about regarding the Queen's policy post-pandemic, essentially, is that we're now in a wonderful situation in terms of a joking situation from a constitutional point of view, in which after this fraught, you can say, conflict between the Crown in Parliament and Parliament itself. We are now left in a situation where the UK Parliament has basically abrogated its responsibility to oversee the government, while the government, during the early days of the pandemic, sequestered the Queen essentially and created basically this bubble around her to, in theory, preserve her from the effects of the pandemic. But in reality, it also removed her as a constitutional consideration. So we were essentially left in a position where constitutionally, the government was ruling through pure fiat, and to some extent still is. The irony, of course, is that the Queen, as the head of the government, in theory, as possessing the government, is probably the most, had this essentially been her intention, had this government been congruent with her aims, Marcus and I were joking before we went on, she would be the most autocratic monarch we've ever had since Magna Carta, essentially, probably since William the Conqueror. But of course, we know that the Queen is not in any way a policy maker, that she has been sequestered away, and we are now seeing this bizarre situation where the Crown in Parliament is basically supreme, irrespective of Parliament and the Queen. But that is the disastrous constitutional situation we are left in.
It sort of seems that at the same time, she's both a lame duck monarch and she's the most tyrannical since William the Conqueror, sort of at once. It's this really strange paradox. You know, like the power wielded on her behalf is immense by the bureaucratic managerial elite, but because she herself is not a policymaker and she herself has been sequestered, she herself doesn't sort of issue any commands as such herself.
Yes, it reminds me of a very Bismarckian situation. My power is predicated on dependency on the monarch, combined with the complete isolation of the monarch.
Yes, quite.
Which is almost exactly the bizarre situation we find ourselves in now.
But rather through a based minister president, through a totally paused parliament and judiciary, etc., etc.
Yes, and I think this sums up my overall argument, which is that Elizabeth II has used inaction and silence to give her actions, or lack thereof, an aura of constitutional neutrality, when in reality, what this ultimately amounts to is tacit consent, almost perpetual capitulation, to the point where she has retained her title. But we'll talk about the cultural aspects now, but the sacerdotal aspect of monarchy is basically ignored, if not ridiculed. The idea that we have some sort of animation, some sort of ritualistic animation to the processes of our government is completely absurd as well. We are left with nothing but inanimate procedure. And again, just going back to the idea of legitimacy, again, because the Queen has basically opted for this role of a president, her function then becomes the legitimation of this system of power, not in contestation. And in reality, during a functioning monarchical government where there is a harmonious relationship between the Queen's Privy Council and the Queen's feudal estates, that would be wonderful. But of course, we know that is simply not the case. And that is the predicament we're in. So without further ado, we'll get to the Queen as the sacred embodiment of the nation and the Queen's relationship with the church, which again is a equally depressing subject to talk about. Is there anything you want to kick us off here?
No, by all means proceed. You're probably more informed about Elizabeth I than I am, so I'm happy just to deflect off you. So
right. Well, I'll take us back quickly to the coronation oath, which we started at. Will you, to your utmost of your power, maintain in the United Kingdom the Protestant Reformed religion established by law? Will you maintain and preserve inviolable the settlement of the Church of England, the Elizabethan settlement in particular, and the doctrine, worship, discipline, and government thereof, as by laws established in England? And will you preserve unto the bishops and clergy of England and to the Church there committed to their charge all such rights and privileges as by law do or shall appertain to them or any of them? Now, of course, in terms of contextualizing Queenie in the grander scheme of the POS, this has been a process of, basically attacking the established religion, cannot be attributed in any way to her. And it will be incredibly unfortunate to attribute any of this to her, but rather she, again, like so many of this, comes in at the end of the road, essentially, and represents the final demise. because, of course, before George V, which we relate to as the beginning of this modern monarchy we're talking about, as defender of the faith, do solemnly and sincerely in the presence of God profess, testify, and declare that I do believe in the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. There is no substantiation of elements of bread and body and wine in the body and blood of Christ at or after the consecration thereof. And essentially it goes on to specifically admonish the elements of what we would previously called popery. And this was the foundation of the Test Act. Basically, in order to become a functioning minister of the crown, or, swear your oath before Parliament, you had to go through the Test Act. And this, of course, was removed after Catholic emancipation in 1829. 1829, and this was then ultimately reserved for the monarch as per the Act of Succession in 1701. After 1910, this was deemed too offensive to Catholics, so we went for the simpler declaration, which I mentioned. And of course, this decline of the Anglican Church and also its physical disestablishment is something which began far before the reign of Elizabeth. Of course, in addition to Catholic emancipation, the government of Gladstone, which I think, again, should be noted that Gladstone had an avowed Republican in his administration, begins the disestablishment of the church in Ireland, basically seeing the Anglican churches one by one disestablished. So in 1919, we see the Welsh church disestablished. The Act of Uniformity, which is a fundamental part of this Elizabethan settlement, which he had sworn to uphold, is already removed in 1888, almost making a farce of the coronation oath itself. However, there is this interesting dynamic which I really want to talk about, the monarchy, and almost relating this back to the Act of Succession, the Glorious Revolution, and a monarch basically representing an accepted sort of system of customs, and a monarch who actually wants to rule as a executive monarch, but in defiance of those customs. And this, of course, brings us to the 1936 abdication crisis, essentially, because we're left in this unique crisis in English history where you have the reactionary and very defiant Archbishop of Canterbury, pictured here on the left, Cosmo Lang, desperately trying to uphold the notion of the sanctity of marriage and against divorce, essentially. And here we have Edward VIII, who is determined to marry the several-time divorcee Wallis Simpson. So the effect of this, I think it's fair to say, is that we have this collaboration with the conservative elements within the country, the more socially conservative elements within the country, under Lang and under then Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, collaborating not just with Conservative Party officials, but with Dominion governments to force the King's hand, basically present him with a fait accompli that he has to abandon Wallis Simpson, or he basically has, as a result of the sacred notion of the coronation ceremony, because of course he has not been crowned, he needs to abdicate and allow for his far more inoffensive brother Albert, who will later become George VI, to become king. Of course, the broader implications of this are you have a fixed conception of what the monarch is supposed to be, and you could almost say the continuation of this idea going back to the Hanoverian importation of the monarch, which is we expect the monarch basically to not put up much of a fuss, to obey this order around him, which in the case of the Queen is erring ever more in a hostile manner towards the very notions of tradition and monarchy. In this case, it is a conservative tradition against essentially the whims. Again, it's not just the marriage. I think the marriage, to my mind, is very much a pretext. Edward VIII was a war hero. He was incredibly popular. And the expectation among the more conservative elite was that he was also a populist. And there were many prominent members of the Conservative Party, such as Winston Churchill, who even advocating forming a King's Party to desperately defend the royal prerogatives, that basically the king could essentially do what he wanted. So at the same time, this represented a castration of the monarchy in one respect, yet it also represented the re-sanctification of the monarchy in another. It's, again, putting this in a larger sort of argument, it's quite difficult to put down. What do you think of it, Marcus?
Oh, well, your sentiments more or less echo mine. But nonetheless, what's actually interesting for me is because I wasn't aware of that about Churchill, about that he was in a position where he wanted to form a King's Party to actually support to support Eddie, and more or less give him a carte blanche to sort of not behave as he pleased, but to sort of support him in that situation with Wallace Simpson. I wasn't aware of that. That's quite interesting. Given also how Churchill would later behave, it's quite an interesting deviation from him being, how should I say, duplicitous to being sort of a more red-blooded supporter of the monarchy.
Mm. So I think, obviously the abdication was presented as a fait accompli. Edward was removed, and of course, George, who was happily married and had 2 children to carry on the succession, was brought in. I mean, in the grander scheme of things, what would have happened had the abdication not happened is that the king would have reigned, Edward the Eighth would have reigned until the 1970s, and then simply what would happen is that Queen Elizabeth would have inherited at a later date. But in terms of like the broader political and constitutional implications, we have no idea essentially what change would have been affected by a hands-on populist monarch ruling for 40 years in the manner of an Edward VIII. So this is all ultimately left to speculation. Of course, there are his connotations with, collaborations with Nazism, etc. And of course,
I was going to say too, because given the time period that he would have been king in as well, I mean, he had a very tumultuous epoch in Europe. Would Britain have carried on? For instance, would Britain have even gone to war? Would would they have survived? And this stream isn't about that, but I'm just saying it brings about a whole question of historical what ifs. That hang around Eddie VIII.
Yes, this is one of the greatest sort of invitations towards counterfactual history ever, which we'll have to avoid, I'm afraid, to get back on topic. But obviously, what Cosmo Lang represents, even if you see him as the defender of you can almost say the sacred nature, the nature of the monarchy, is that Cosmo Lang was in many ways an aberration, because he was replaced in 1942 by William Temple, a former Labour Party member and a writer trying to, you can say more overtly than distributism, because many people accuse distributism of socialistic leanings. I, of course, vehemently disagree with that. But with William Temple, the socialism and the ecumenism of what he wanted to bring to the C of E was manifest. I mean, he wrote a book, The Christianity and the Social Order. Of course, he dies very soon after his appointment, so we don't sort of get to see what the overall effects of that will be. But what we're demonstrating is that the C of E has already taken a turn. I mean, it's already undergone a series of administrative changes. In this case, the various church assemblies, which would then gravitate towards the church synod. That the Church of England is in a crisis of identity. And as we see with the Catholic Church, with the Second Vatican Council, we see similar attempts within the Anglican Church to, if not modernize, then again appear more sympathetic to the outside considerations of how does one become a Christian in an increasingly secularized world. Essentially, we have the Methodist Synod again trying to, as part of this grander ecumenism, which again is echoed by the Second Vatican Council, to try and bring the church together. In addition to that, the C of E is basically, I would recommend to everyone you read Peter Hitchens' Abolition of Britain, because he explains this in depth. But essentially, a lot of the Christian social fabric of the nation was undermined in the 1960s, and was undermined directly by the then Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins, who pushed through a series of incredibly far-reaching policies and social legislation, essentially, the legalization of abortion, the acceptance of homosexuality, etc. The fundamental basis of this, however, was the reversion, the secularization of the nation's culture and undoing England as essentially Christian nation. And this is essentially the situation which the Queen finds herself in at the moment, is that she begins, and you can almost say her relationship with the church begins in a very conservative bent, which is that there is this attempt by her sister Margaret to marry Captain Townsend, who of course is a divorcee. The Church of England is resolute in the fact that a divorcee should not be able to remarry, especially to Margaret, to damage the monarchy further. However, from that point, from this original conservative reiteration, the C of E essentially, undermines itself over and over again, to the point of view where it basically surrenders that function as the moral arbiter of the nation. And of course, the Queen isn't responsible for the theological sentiments, but she is ultimately responsible, because lest we all forget, she is the supreme governor of the Church of England, and she is bound by oath to preserve the integrity of the Protestant Reformed faith in the country. And of course, the effect of this is that, by 1969, virtually all segments except Section 8 of the Act of Supremacy of that Elizabethan settlement, which by name she was again sworn to defend, had been basically undone. And the effect of this was that this legislation essentially had to be undone because it was advocating, among other things, Britain's fundamental sovereignty. And of course, what happens in 1973? Britain joins the European Economic Community. We essentially have, from the Act of Supremacy, from the Act of Uniformity, and of course, even before that, from the Declaration of the Strength of the Right of Appeal, all the way through to 1970s, the idea that England cannot be sundered to any foreign authority. And of course, under Queen Elizabeth II, this happens under the Edward Heath government in the 1970s. But relating this back to what the implications are for the Christian Church, of course, we see the creation of the alternative prayer book, and again moving away from the beautiful practices begun by Thomas Cranmer, the 1660 Common Prayer Book again being one of the best examples of that. And we see the church adopting more progressive elements. So we have women's ordination, of course, and then to top all of this, as part of this alliance with Europe and the EEC, now come the European Union. One of the first acts of the Blair government is to place England basically under the authority, the judicial authority of the Human Rights Declaration of Europe. And freedom of religion is a fundamental component of that. So what we're demonstrating is that whilst the Queen, in theory, was responsible to uphold the fundamental religious character of the state religion, the actual result of her reign has been the secularization and for all intents and purposes, the Church of England is disestablished in all but name. Its numbers are dropping. Between 1969 and 2015, church attendance has halved, ordinations are declining, the church is selling off dozens of properties every year, and of course, ultimately, the church would moderate its stance regarding divorce. All of these elements, regrettably, from the, you can say, the conception of a conservative order under Cosmo Lang, have now been undone. And I don't really want to get into a conversation regarding Justin Welby without causing my blood pressure to go through the roof.
Also, and this discussion obviously isn't pertaining to this, but not just the moderation of divorce, the church's attitude towards divorce, but its attitude towards everything, and how the church has almost been absconded sort of as another arm of the cathedral, so to speak, if I can use the terminology.
Yes, and again, in fairness to Elizabeth II, the church has done a wonderful job of destroying itself and its own moral mission, but ultimately, again, it is her church. She is the supreme governor of the Church of England. So we're left, again, as is the case of so many, we're left with the substance of a state religion. We're left with the Lord Spiritual, still, again, periodically advocating for progressive causes. And again, as we have a monarchy which has made this Faustian pact with progressives, that issue has now recurred in the church itself as well. So all of these elements are represented as part of a definitive trend that one can't ignore. And of course, compare that with Elizabeth I, who not only, exalted this idea of, personal virtue in her essence as Gloriana, as Mary to the nation, but that she, again, very seriously took over her role as the supreme governor of the Church of England, taking this, middle course between, Catholicism and extreme Protestantism, wanting to maintain the fundamentally hierarchical nature of the church. And in that case, she succeeded. She succeeded in preserving a state religion, essentially, a unique English conception of what it meant to be a Christian, whilst making it a fundamental institution which bolstered the strength of the crown itself. So again, the irony, of course, of the reign name of Elizabeth being Elizabeth II is that in Elizabeth I, you can say you have one of the few successful and almost the zenith or the supreme example of the namesake Elizabethan settlement being employed. And ironically, under the second Elizabeth, you have the Elizabethan settlement becoming redundant, almost completely redundant.
It's almost like a complete reversal between the original and the namesake that came, many years down the line. Can I just address one comment in the chat? just while we're having a pause here.
Yeah, sure.
Just because he's a long-time viewer, 99 Iron Duke. I just wanted to say, his comment reads, and I'm not picking on you, Iron Duke, by the way. I'm not doing it for that purpose. Just the comment reads, so all of us men can just blame Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II then. That makes me feel so much better. It was all Liz's fault. No, I just want to say, I think
we've gone out of our way to try and give her as much credit as possible. I mean, but again, that's
that, and also we have heaped blame on a number of people who aren't Her Majesty. I mean, we've talked about Tony Blair extensively. We've spoken about even some of her predecessors. You know, be it Eddie with Wallace Simpson, be it even George V. Be it,
and how the church, we went about William Temple and how the church was basically successful in posing itself before.
Correct. And we've touched on the colonies a little bit. We've touched on Pierre Trudeau. We've touched on the Australian Whitlam government with the Governor General. We will touch on Rhodesia. There's plenty of blame to go around that is not just pertaining to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, but as an underlying statement to cap that off. She is the monarch, and she has reigned for an awful long time, and an awful lot of duty rests upon her shoulders. As a result of that, she did take an oath upon her ascendancy to the throne, and ergo, a significant proportion of the blame resides on her shoulders as a result. But that's not to say that it is exclusively her fault or that she's exclusively the cause of this. Just want to make that clear.
No,
and again, that's not to pick out on Iron Duke. It's just, it was worth mentioning.
What we're arguing is
very much appreciated listener, Iron Duke.
And likewise, I want to echo those sentiments regarding Iron Duke. Thank you for watching. But yes, what we're mentioning is basically a pattern of acquiescence. In terms of whether the Queen actively goes along with this, again, I go back to my Schrodinger's political stance a lot, which is that I cannot say with confidence what the sentiments of the Queen are, and we're left with myriad functions that some can fit within a historical narrative, some cannot. This is almost what the Queen feels is irrelevant, because as we say, you know, going back to the first point I made, if silence is basically tacit consent, it implies that you really should have said something. And this is my point. All of these issues pertain directly to something which we can call on, as the Queen is having sort of sworn herself to, which is the coronation oath. And so we are judging her by the coronation oath, even though we're contextualizing and saying that already a lot of damage had been done to that sacramental aspect of monarchy as a result of her predecessors.
Yeah, I think that's quite true. And just to finish off this point, just from my end, I mean, Iron Duke's not wrong. Yes, she's a little old lady in her 90s, but she's a little old lady in her 90s now. You know, she was not in her 90s 30, 40 years ago, when she was a far more, you know, mentally agile and with a sort of person.
And as we
this rot has set in for a long, long time. It hasn't just happened now.
Yes, and as we demonstrated, she was far more politically active in the 50s and 60s than she is now. But right. Yes, moving on from this point, I want to get to probably what the most popularized elements of the monarchy, which is the monarch as celebrity, is, you know, ridiculous as that really sounds, but, you know, it's something which we need to get into, which is
you really struck the chord with these three photos here.
Yeah. Sorry.
You've really sort of created the theme here with these three photos and the sort of, you know, monumental devolution of royal politics.
Oh yes, because this goes back to something which the monarchy has somewhat succeeded in, but I would argue it's all unraveling now, which is the notion of the monarch as basically a theatrical. The monarchy is a theatrical institution. The monarchy as a show, which, you know, goes back to the later reign of Queen Victoria, just before George X and Edward VII. The significance of this is, of course, you know, we were talking about, you know, when monarchs had more actual direct authority, when they were actual executive monarchs, even during the Georgian period. However, I would say that royal ceremony and the royal rituals were a shamble in the early Victorian era. I mean, William IV, one of the most forgotten monarchs, who was the Queen Victoria's uncle, essentially didn't want a coronation at all. And when he finally got a coronation, he just wore his naval ensign, basically. He did not care. And when Queen Victoria was crowned, again, this is the beginning of the peak of Britain's power post its victory over Napoleon at Waterloo, the whole coronation was botched, and I would refer you all to watch David Starkey's I think it was 2006 lecture on monarchy, where he talks about the complete farce involving the blind archbishop trying to force the ring of office onto the wrong figure essentially, and the choirs singing inappropriately and using the wrong prayer book. All of this insanity essentially revolving around the coronation of Queen Victoria. And of course, Queen Victoria, after Albert died, was a singularly unpopular monarch because she withdrew essentially to enter a very prolonged period of mourning. Hence, we enter Viscount Esher. Viscount Esher is significant in that he is responsible essentially for the celebration of monarchy as pageantry in the form of the modern jubilee. So he is principally responsible for the golden jubilee of 1887 and the diamond jubilees of 1897. And of course, with Edward VII, the monarchy is brought back in all glory with pomp and ceremony, even though, again, in terms of personality, he is the complete antithesis of his son, grandson, and great-granddaughter, essentially, in terms of his active involvement of politics, his direct influence on foreign policy, and of course his rather libertine lifestyle. But nevertheless, Esher remains as basically this grey eminence behind the scenes, both influencing the royals' pageantry and politics throughout this entire time. And here again, we get to the most crucial point regarding the future state of the monarchy, which is the year 1917. Where George V did a number of things. He refused Nicholas II coming over after the Russian Revolution, and he changed the German name of the royal family, which of course then was Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha, to Windsor. And from a completely cosmetic point of view, I think Windsor is a very clever recontextualization of the monarchy, because of course those of us who are steeped in medieval history know that the dynasty name, in the case of Wittelsbach, in the case of Habsburg, often relates to a steading or a castle essentially. And of course Windsor is the monarch's steading, and the fact that Windsor has this Shakespearean association of course instantly sort of gives the impression that there is something organically English to the name, despite the fact that this is a completely inorganic process that has seldom ever happened in history, whereby the monarch has been forced to actually change the dynasty name in such a ridiculous cosmetic fashion. But in addition to that, I mentioned
also due to the pressures of the time as well. In the interwar period, there was a profound notion of Germanophobia in the populace, and so transitioning from one name to the other was expedient as well.
Yes, and in addition to that, of course, he eschewed all his German titles at the same time. And of course, all of the German monarchs and the monarch of Germany, Wilhelm II, would lose their thrones, essentially. And George V, of course, as the victor, retained his. And of course, some, historian could look back at this and say George V was, instrumental in saving the monarchy. But again, at what cost, essentially, because England was in a far more stable political situation at that time compared to Russia or Germany or indeed Austria-Hungary, all of which we've mentioned on other streams. I would refer you to our Fall of Eagles series. But of course, in addition to this, there is another fundamental act, which is that we have the 1772 Royal Marriages Act. And the whole notion of this is that even though the idea of morganatic marriage, i.e., marriage between unequal parties, in this case it would be a monarch and a commoner, or a monarch and someone not of the blood royal, there isn't anything in English law which ever expressly forbade that, as there were in other succession disputes throughout Europe. However, with the exception, I believe, of Anne Hyde, who was the first wife of James II, who wasn't expected to become king because he was the brother, virtually all consorts of the monarch, with the exception of George IV, who married his Catholic mistress, were of the blood royal, effectively. And the result of this order of council, basically, because of the nature of the Royal Marriages Act, permitting the future offspring of the family to marry subjects not of the blood royal, means that we're now in this situation where, first of all, George VI marries Elizabeth of Bowles-Lyon. And of course, even though she is a Scottish aristocrat, she is nevertheless not of the blood royal. So even though, again, this was held up by Cosmo Lang as this symbol of the the virtue and sanctity of monarchy, there's already an element of subversion which has already taken place, because of course George V married Mary of Teck, who was of the blood royal, and of course she remained in a very powerful position as the Queen Mother until after the death of her son in 1953. And the effect of this, going back, going far further into the future, and arriving at the Annus Horribilis, is that what we're talking about is a monarchy which is obsessed with the idea of theatre, obsessed with the idea of image, whilst the actual animating features of the monarchy, you can see the Evolian animation, is being constantly undermined, and the actual prerogatives of monarchy are constantly in decline. So when we are facing a situation from the 1980s onwards, culminating in Diana, where the monarch basically has to deal with scandal after scandal within the royal family, which damages the reputation of the monarch, and of course the ultimate scandal revolving around the failed marriage of Prince Charles and Diana. Essentially, this results, I would say, ultimately in a trivialization of the monarchy. Once you have sundered all of these sacred and political aspects of the monarchy, and you have, under Isha's direction, beginning in the late reign of Queen Victoria, rededicated yourself towards pageantry and image, the myth-making, essentially, of a new national religion out of, of basically, what a very I would say ordinary people, in the sense the royal family are very flawed people. And then, of course, this system is subject to controversy and subject to scandal, as every single royal dynasty is. I would argue that scandal in this case, in the case of the 1990s, is far more damaging to this conception of monarchy, because it is a monarchy which is predicated on image. Whereas previous monarchs could, of course, be mired by a scandal, but the notion of executive and sacred elements of the monarchy were clear. So scandals were nothing more than, you would argue, a wound of the flesh. Whereas when we arrive at a celebrity monarch, when you've reduced the monarchy to basically that of popularity, of that of celebrity, then it becomes embroiled in these ridiculous tabloid-esque feuds. And we're basically seeing that accelerated en masse. I mean, obviously with Kate and William, Kate, far from being an aristocrat, was a commoner. The way to get around that, of course, was to create her as the Duchess of Sussex. The same thing, of course, happened with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Meghan Markle was created as the Duchess of Sussex again, to get around this idea that you are deliberately marrying commoners, even though we all know that this is just entirely superficial. And of course, the effect of Harry and Meghan has essentially led to one PR disaster for the monarchy after the other, and what would appear to be a series of constant concessions made on the part of the Queen to basically counteract these constant charges leveled by Meghan about the monarchy being somehow inhuman, but beyond that, being racist, etc. And of course, Meghan isn't unique in that front, because these similar claims are also advanced by Diana. So again, it's this trivialization of the monarchy to appear more empathetic, to appear more caring, to basically remove everything that makes it the monarchy and make it into just another family, essentially, removed from all spiritual trappings or sense of duty. And that is the situation which we ultimately find ourselves in. And I mean, I don't really want to talk at length about the effects of Harry and Meghan, because it's so banal. I mean, it's almost beneath consideration talking about this pathetic feud between, now what you can argue, derisively, the Markles, because Harry is so obviously the junior member of this relationship, and the Queen. And the fact that the Queen seems to take it seriously and has gone out of her way to, again, I believe, even promote a diversity coach as a response to this, just to me reeks of desperation, and the fact that the monarchy is nothing more than a tabloid institution. And that it's not just a legacy of Elizabeth II, but that is a legacy which one can chart back to late Victoria and George V.
It's almost as if, rather than sort of, those of us who think as we do sometimes have a a heroic take on things, whether it's sort of a Carlylean context or perhaps an Evoldian context, or some kind of we would entertain, or we would hold close to our heart some notion of a heroic ideal, or that a monarch, even though it's not going to be that sort of armor clad Richard the Lionheart type or Edward the Longshanks. We don't live in those times, but the ability to eliminate on principle, the ability to fulfill oaths, the ability to do as what a monarch ought to do in principle, which is to to make decisions contingent on what is best for the nation and its people, and rather than this sort of roaring of a wounded colossus or anything like that, what we're seeing are these sort of petty whimperings of a creature dying in the corner, curled up. That's what this has panned out to be. I know that's a really startling description of events, but when you see what this has been reduced to, as you've very nicely explained, Apostolic, this royal family has just become almost like a cheap tabloid family, a creature of celebrity. It really makes you wonder, what is then the point of the monarchy if it's not going to behave as a royal family, if they're not going to act in a manner which is a courting of royals? It just sort of seems that these people exist to just sell magazines and be political punching bags for some elements of the political spectrum, and delusions for another part of the political spectrum. It's a rather sad state of affairs.
I mean, the irony, of course, reading Abolition of Britain is, and again, a thing I would argue, which is very detrimental to our sense of nationhood in this country, is the wholesale importation of American culture post the Second World War, even elements of it beginning with the end of the First World War. And what Peter Hitchens basically describes, because of course I wasn't around in the 1960s, is that after, even after Suez, even after this, great national calamity, which, was, you could say, the death knell of empire at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, which would later characterize the decline thereafter, is that when a minor royal would come to visit, there was this magical quality which today could only be ascribed to that of basically a celebrity in the American vein, essentially, that the royal family and the English aristocracy were celebrities in their own right, and it was a distinct form of English celebrity, essentially. Now, of course, post the 1970s, post the ridiculous Silver Jubilee, getting into the Golden Jubilee, all of that is essentially undone. We have a Americanized celebrity conception in addition to a monarchy, which is itself becoming, reduced to a mere celebrity institution. And of course, this might result in the banality as represented by the Sussexes, so to speak. And I think this has major implications for the future of the monarchy, because whilst the Queen has at least attempted to adopt this veneer of constitutional neutrality, of course, Charles is very outspoken on a series of political issues. Not one, of course, the main one being environmentalism. On the one sense, one could look at him as as quite reactionary in the way that he has made a genuine enterprise out of the Duchy of Cornwall, in the fact that it is almost as if he is this advocating this idea of noblesse oblige, essentially, that he's trying to make his land more productive, and he's trying to create this effective working relationship between his tenants in the way that a benevolent liege would do to his vassals, essentially. Yet, and of course, you have the architectural influence through such constructions as Poundland. Yet on the other side of that, he's been so ridiculed and so damaged by this notion of the celebritization of the monarchy through his association with Diana, not to mention the fact that, his environmental agenda looks so much more as if it's got the consent of, you can say, big power backing, essentially, that, and of course, we enter another weird predicament, which is that the Queen has reigned so long. Do we really want a monarch who will probably be over the age of 80 when he finally is to the throne? There's almost this expectation that he might skip and give it again to a conventional and, for lack of a better word, boring heir in the form of William. William, again, who is in a similar way to Harry, has decided to adopt these American styles of, emotional outpouring and, talking about mental health issues, etc. I mean, that's fine within a given context, but it is completely antithetical to this ancient notion of the monarchy as removed from all that and in some way supernatural. The ironic thing is, in humanizing the monarchy, as someone like William no doubt has to many people, you are also making the monarchy irrelevant. Like, why should I invest, William, with any of this of authority? I mean, can you imagine the idea of a actual sacerdotal coronation happening in this current political context?
I can't, no. not in a million years. Yes, and it sort of seems that in some way, and it does depend to what degree Blairism and Tony Blair himself and his machinations tie into this, whether there's sort of some kind of a deal with the devil somewhere there. Who's to know? Frankly, none of us do. We can only speculate. But to what degree have the royals, has the House of Windsor, under the stewardship of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, to what degree have they traded off this celebrity sort of status, this what's the word that you used before, this sort of commonality that the royals have started to demonstrate, this sort of more celebrity status, sort of a tabloid monarchy? To what degree have they traded that for some sort of guarantee or some sense of survivability in the modern age? But with that has come the poison pill of irrelevancy, like you say, a loss of majesty, a loss of prestige. And to what degree can they keep making these false bargains with diminishing returns? Because that's what it really has come to look like.
Yes, no, but again, that's the whole nature of what you've brilliantly illustrated about a Faustian pact. All Faustian pacts ultimately end in hell. They end in damnation. Right. And this is the road, because every iteration, every decade, we see the concession of something else to the outside world. The monarchy is, I hesitate to say whoring, but it is appeasing the modern world in every way which can be seen conceivable. And in the end, once you have an institution,
a debasement, you could say.
Once you have an institution which isn't confident in itself, that cannot advocate any sort of special purpose, when essentially I would say the only special popularity held by any one of the royals is Queen Elizabeth herself. And again, you could almost say that this is, the fact that she hasn't abdicated, the fact that she has held on to this power for so long, is also severely detrimental to the future of the monarchy, in the sense that she hasn't allowed other members of the royal family to really shine, in the fact that, you could almost say she has monopolized this goodwill essentially from the monarchists, that there is, I would say, a genuine feeling of dread regarding her death as to the ultimate implications of the monarchy due to this ridiculous situation that we're in. But I think, again, before just lamenting this, because it is so banal, I want to get to your consideration on the nature of the Commonwealth, etc., because this is the last factor I really want to talk about, which is the Queen of what? We commonly in this country sort of see herself as the Queen of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, but of course that isn't just the case. I mean, inescapably, as a result of the creation of the bastions of the British Empire, even in the Coronation Oath, which I'll come back to now, will you solemnly promise and swear to govern the peoples of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, Northern Ireland, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Union of South Africa, and of course the iteration here being Pakistan and Ceylon, none of which would last in the personal ken of the monarch for very long, and obviously governing them with belonging or pertaining according to their respective laws and customs. This is of course a reduced list, because this would later come to include Jamaica, Barbados, Belize, Grenada, whilst Pakistan, Ceylon, and South Africa would renege, and other nations such as Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Malta would accede and then very quickly break off from their personal union with the Queen. And this leads to a long-lasting debate within late Victorian England, which is how to organize the British Empire moving forward. And the advocacy of people like Joseph Chamberlain, who was a very prominent colonial secretary during the heart of splendid isolation, was pushing towards things such as imperial preference. And of course, this was a policy which was begun in earnest really under Disraeli. And pushing, first of all, imperial preference would have created some form of customs union, essentially an imperial version of the European Economic Community. And then, of course, with economic integration, you've already had political integration, but then you have a political integration of a new kind. So say, for example, an imperial federation. But of course, all of this confidence was broken by Britain's disastrous entry and the empire's disastrous entry into the First World War. You still had series of imperial conferences, lasting all the way up until just before the outbreak of the Second World War. In this case, would be 1937. But as we've already mentioned, you have the 1926, Balfour Declaration. You have the 1931 Statute of Westminster. All of these territories of the old Commonwealth, essentially, which had been given, progressively elements of home rule, were basically given independence. And this idea that they were ever going to be integrated economically and politically was instead transitioned into this idea that Elizabeth should essentially be the conduit through all these realms. These realms will not be united politically, they will not be united economically, but they will be united through the person of the monarch. And of course, this is the implication. Now we have the political division of the old Commonwealth. What is the Queen's first prerogative? Is she first and foremost the Queen of Great Britain? Yet at the same time, the British Parliament has been at pains to demonstrate that it is no longer the over Parliament, essentially, of all the other dominions. The dominions are equal and have their own sovereign parliaments, essentially. So does the Queen owe a particular allegiance to Canada, to South Africa, to Australia? Of course, the domains which she reigned over temporarily and lost, but then became part of the Commonwealth, such as Nigeria and Uganda, and of course India, which had been lost under her father. So again, this is a process that she inherited, essentially. This isn't a process that she began with. I mean, with 1948, you have the British Nationality Act. With 1949, you have the creation of the actual terminology of the Commonwealth. Basically, World War II, and you can say the end of the British Raj, leads to this transition from the empire to the Commonwealth piecemeal, with all of these segments basically renegotiating their relationship with Britain rather than a dramatic decline. It was really a transition into something else. But of course, this points to something else, which I think has to be mentioned. I'll be careless not to mention, which is what is the nature of being a subject of the monarch? Of course, in 1948, with the British Nationality Act, to not offend anyone, essentially, from all of these nascent countries, the notion of being a subject of the crown, and again, this is key to the idea of feudal homage, essentially. In a monarchy, we do not have citizens, we have subjects. You are subject and loyal and beholden to the monarch who is transfigured and above all other persons, essentially. But of course, right from the end of the reign of George VI, the beginning of the reign of Elizabeth II, you have these wholesale Republican importation of terms such as citizen. And in this case, a Commonwealth citizen was a blanket term referring then to, nearly 1 billion people, around 800 billion people. The nature of, immigration laws at the beginning.
Did you mean 800 million?
Sorry, yes, I did mean, I did mean 800 million. Yes, nearly 1 billion, 800 million. Yes, I know that sounds a lot, but yes, that is correct. But of course, what was the implication of this? I think I mentioned on another stream that I joked that due to the upbringing of our political elites, the fact that we have an imperial elite, essentially, who are bred to govern this vast empire, that after the transition of the empire into the Commonwealth, I jokingly said that the response essentially was to import the empire into Britain. But that almost unironically was the case from 1948 until 1962, because 800 million people had the right to work in England without a visa during that time. And it was only after, again, 11 years of Conservative government in 1961 that Rab Butler then pushes for immigration controls against persons within the Commonwealth. And of course, this leads to mass immigration, the origins of mass immigration. So I have to ask ask the question. These are all Commonwealth citizens, even though we're employing that ridiculous Republican term. But these were all formerly British subjects, and they were all subjects to the crown. So again, it's this conception that you have this fundamental, you can say, antagonism between the particularism of all of these individual nations, which to some extent want to retain their individual identity, yet the monarch is ruler of so many different people that you have this natural conflict. And I relay this back to another person I've talked about extensively on this channel, which is Franz Josef, because Franz Josef, of course, ruled over a multinational empire, the Habsburg Empire, later Austria-Hungary. And one of the things that was constantly leveled against him was that he was prioritizing certain ethnic minorities over the largest ethnic minority, of course, who were the Germans. So he was constantly at odds to, promote the Hungarians, say, or, you have this this difficult issue between giving the Czechs autonomy and whether it would be a Czech nation at the expense of the Germans, etc. So throughout it, and again, this is almost described as nationality conflicts. What I'm trying to illustrate is that the Commonwealth, the transition from the empire, the failed project to integrate all of these territories still leaves us with a form of nationality conflict where the Queen, who is sovereign over all of these territories, owes no particular allegiance to any of them and has to essentially ameliorate all the different concerns of each individual nation. She is not the Queen of England. England, it doesn't even appear in her title. She is the Queen of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and as a result, she is the Queen of another 16 Commonwealth nations, all of which are in personal union with Elizabeth. And of course, the Commonwealth, as it stands today, consists of 54 states again. And talking about a affinity towards the Commonwealth, in 1953. Of course, she becomes queen during a world tour, essentially. One of her first broadcasts, her first Christmas Day broadcast, no, actually, I think it was the second in 1953, which was dedicated towards essentially furthering ties with the Commonwealth. And of course, the old Commonwealth we refer to as the Old Dominions listed, or what derisively called the White Settler Nations. Then you have the Suez Crisis, and this grand imperial conception of the empire completely falls apart, even though you've already had to deal with this constant decentralization. And of course, this, one can argue, Suez is this last-ditch attempt of the two main colonial powers, France and Britain, to hold on to political power. They even at one point looked as if there was going to be some sort of proto-European union involving the British and French empires, but of course that never materialized.
And you might say too, in some odd way, the last flickering of the Entente Cordiale that actually functioned beyond more than just ceremony.
Yes, exactly. And but of course, that was politics then. We're talking, post-war politics from about 1946 until 1958, where England and France were natural allies. And again, they almost had a shared conception of trying to deal with this overarching identity. With the idea of the Queen, it was unification around the monarchy and this idea of transitioning into being a Commonwealth citizen as opposed to a subject of the British Empire. With France, it was slightly different because, of course, you don't have a monarchy in France. You have this Republican conception. So famously advocated among, one of the more prominent interwar prime ministers, Léon Blum, you have this notion that France is not an ethnicity. France is basically a culture and a set of Republican values, essentially. And because there is no ethnic connotation to being French, the idea of France as representing Republican values and the intrinsic value of French culture can basically be ascribed to all of our colonies. And of course, this was actually put into practice rather than again follow this process of the decentralization of the dominions. You had areas, vast swathes of Africa, like Algeria, were formally incorporated into the Fourth Republic. And what you can argue is reactionary aspect against this was that when de Gaulle comes in and establishes the Fifth Republic, he abandons such a notion of a grand non-ethnic conception of France even to the point of abandoning the Pied Noir in Algeria to focus on a France which is fundamentally European and I would say more Napoleonic in its outlook, as opposed to this.
However, by that point, they'd already made Algeria part of metropolitan France, and there was really no going back from that.
But of course, then
from a legal standpoint, I'm saying.
From a legal standpoint, of course, then Algeria fought a long independence war against France and was again given its independence under Charles de Gaulle. So Charles de Gaulle was fighting against what you could say is their version of the the Commonwealth citizen, essentially the empire. Essentially, France was fighting a war about its own. What is the nature of being French itself, and of course. We do not have such a privilege in our cultural sphere because whilst Canadians, people from New Zealand, Australians, you and me can speak in the same language despite being thousands of miles apart, we are always in the shadow of America, which has almost come to dominate the Anglosphere away from the mother country, essentially. And of course, one of the effects of the Suez Crisis is that America exerted its domination at the expense of the Commonwealth and the Empire. And because the Eisenhower administration basically was not prepared to back up, and they were thinking they were looking forward to relationships with future, decolonized governments, essentially in Africa and the Middle East, America, you could say, finally finished off the British Empire. And this is where we get to the winds of change post-Suez, the Suez Crisis, and the again this Harold Macmillan's very provocatively gave the winds of change speech, which ushered in this new period of accelerated decolonization from the 1960s. I mean, it had already begun piecemeal before then. I believe Ghana was a dominion a few years before. But of course, the effect of this was that countries which had been in personal union with the Queen, such as South Africa, unilaterally declared independence and removed all associations with the Commonwealth because of this new winds of change policy that was basically taken by the Queen. So it was, you can almost say, not only it's interesting in a way, sort of looking at this process not only as decolonization, but even dismantling the old idea of the old Commonwealth in the process. And this is probably one of the more controversial aspects, which we get to the Queen and multiculturalism and the situation in Rhodesia. Marcus, would you like to explain a bit more about that?
Do you want to sort of start on the same tack that we started our pre-chat about, and then I'll sort of chime in with the Fraser government situation?
Yeah. I'll just give a little bit of backstory. What we're sort of demonstrating is that what does the Commonwealth essentially represent? Well, once you have the importation, essentially the new Commonwealth of all the countries that became independent post-Suez, is that you can point to there's some sort of shared link between the British Empire. But it goes more than that. Once you have, the Singapore Declaration and the Harare Declaration, the conception of the Commonwealth, what would later be adopted by the Commonwealth Foundation, very much mirrors that of the Democrats of the United States at the same time, and the United Nations, in that it is an organization which stands not for the conception of monarchy, because again, remember, the entire basis of the Commonwealth is monarchy. The foundation is that we are transitioning from a potential imperial federation to a series of independent states which are bound by personal union to Queen Elizabeth II herself. So ironically, we have this conception of the Commonwealth which isn't bound by any particular notions of monarchy. Instead, it's bound by again, basically a charter like the League of Nations regarding international law, global economic development, peace and security, racial equality, liberty, equal rights based on gender, creed, political belief. Essentially, what we're seeing is a form of globalization, which is ushered in under an organization which is headed by a monarch who is leading a series of personal unions. So what I linked this back to earlier, when we're off stream, Marcus, was Elizabeth I. We've at pains to demonstrate that Elizabeth I represents an antithesis. Elizabeth is, in a way, the true particularist monarch of England. Previous monarchs before then had connections with France, either due to culture dynasty or through direct territorial acquisition. And even Henry VIII still had a footing in France through Calais, and he wanted to be king of both France and of Scotland. So his focus was European, more, and of course, you could almost argue that the Reformation was the natural result of his failure to establish this recognition, this power in France and in Scotland, and the failure of his alliance with Charles V. But that's another conversation. When we come to Elizabeth, she is inheriting the throne off the back of the disastrous collaboration between Spain and England, which characterized the marriage of Philip of Spain to Mary. And the result of this was England losing its last continental possession, Calais. From 1558 until 1603, what Queen Elizabeth does, in addition to restoring the Church of England, restoring the supremacy, adopting the mantra of the supreme governor, trying, again, you almost in this absolutist Caesaro-papist way of combining the Evolian pontifical nature of monarchy as that of a priest and a secular ruler. But she is also defending the nation against all attempts to assail it from without. So, of course, England is nothing more than a pawn between the two major powers at that time, being the Spanish Empire under the Habsburgs, under Philip II, and the French, of course. And this, of course, what immortalizes her. She successfully leads that defense at the potential invasion of the Spanish Armada in 1588, and henceforth is immortalized by it. So what we have, you can say, is almost the quintessential view of Little England versus the world. And here we have the complete inversion of that, which is, we talk a lot about deracinization, cultures being sort of uprooted and detached from their sacred traditions. I would argue that the Queen has a similar function to that. You can argue even more pronounced than that of a Franz Josef, because Franz Josef wasn't committed to, globalization in the manner of which we see from the United Nations, which is basically the corresponding charter of the Commonwealth. Franz Josef was committed to an ancient conception of monarchy, an imperial conception of monarchy, as the ultimate defense of the Catholic Church, and he believed he held all his nations due to ancient sacred right, not due to the empire, which is a relatively modern conception. Even the nations that were created out of the empire post were, many advocates will say that they were artificial creations. So again, I ask sort of the question, what is the Queen for? And this is where we get to the Rhodesia situation, which is the inverse of that, where we're talking about decolonization. Well, of course, the British government at that time supported racial equality, and they supported black majority rule. Of course, a lot of people will point out then that the effect of that policy was that many of these countries almost instantaneously became dictatorships, beginning with Niamey and Nkrumah. With Ian Smith, however, in 1965, he, of course, was the local prime minister, I believe it was Southern Rhodesia, and it was one of the richest possessions within the British Empire, of course, more associated with that, epitome of imperial grandeur, Cecil Rhodes.
Indeed, just for reference sake, Zambia is Northern Rhodesia. FYI.
Yes, thank you. And modern day Zimbabwe is Southern Rhodesia, which just became Rhodesia. But the effect was that, of course, Ian Smith was now in a political situation where he was governing on the behalf of basically the Rhodesian whites. And he offered to the Queen a solution whereby he would become independent. He didn't want to follow along with this policy, which has been executed elsewhere, which had already led to South Africa abandoning the Commonwealth. And the effect of it was that his solution, rather than becoming a republic, was to offer the Queen the same predicament which had been offered to other dominions, which was that she would become the Queen of Rhodesia in the same way that she would become the Queen of Canada and Australia. But rather than accept the proposal, she removed Ian Smith. And later, the British government was directly responsible for removing him from power in order to usher in the administration of Robert Mugabe. And of course, during the 1980s and 1990s, Robert Mugabe was lauded by the Commonwealth. But of course, towards the end of the 1990s, we see the dramatic about turn where we see the forced reappropriation of farmland and, of course, the corresponding economic disaster. The Commonwealth removed him, yet at the same time, it was the Commonwealth policy officiated over by the Queen as his representative, which enabled someone like a Mugabe to seize power in Rhodesia. And again, it's the implication of who does the Queen represent and what is the Queen for, essentially, because she certainly isn't for the institutions of monarchy.
And just for some reference points for our guests and audience as well. And actually, thank you, 999 Duke. Yes, Smith indeed was an RAF Spitfire pilot from the Second World War, so he had a very intact fealty to the concept of the British Empire and what he sort of represented and what he was fighting for. But just in respect to Rhodesia specifically, the roughly 75 to 80% of Rhodesia's manpower was in fact black and not white, and in fact black and whites fought side by side against the ZANU-PF and other guerrilla forces. And these guerrilla forces, mostly made up of ZANU-PF, which was led by Mugabe, and other elements of it, were almost entirely equipped by the USSR. So they had a very distinct Soviet slant to them. And just on how tangents that we've had amongst ourselves about sort of liberalism and the West and this sort of this ersatz right wing sort of culture we've been living in for the last few decades. You think of this: you have Thatcher in power in England throughout in Britain throughout the 80s. You have the Fraser government throughout Australia in the early 80s, prior to Hawke winning government, I think in 80 through 84, because that was Australian Labor, and also, with the exception of Carter, you've had Republicans in America. And, not that that's part of the Commonwealth, I'm just sort of speaking of the Anglosphere broadly. And there was almost a unilateral embargo of Rhodesia. And Rhodesia was only receiving supplies through South Africa, who were supplying Rhodesia basically through a sly backdoor. And only for then South Africa to then have its eye turned upon it by its international community, basically, who would then take an anti-apartheid stance thereafter. So basically the proverbial noose was tightening around the southern portion of Africa, the residual commonwealth that existed in the southern half of Africa throughout those decades. And Ian Smith was, you might say, the first victim of this, and the Rhodesian people.
And I think, again, this, what we've been at pains to illustrate, and why I'm so lucky to have Marcus on this evening, is that the Queen is not an English phenomena; she is a global phenomena. And when we talk about things like the independence referendum of Scotland, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, that's basically meaningless compared to everything that we've illustrated here. I mean, what the relationship between Queen and Scotland ultimately doesn't matter. Scotland is still going to be run by the SNP, who are effectively again ultimately socialists, who, instead of pining towards unity towards the United Kingdom, pine for a unity with the European Union. What does it matter if Scotland becomes a republic or Scotland remains a dominion of the Queen? Because what does ultimately the Queen represent? She doesn't represent a series of values. She represents a decay of tradition, not a tradition in itself. I mean, traditores, the idea of tradition is that it's something you hand down. And what we've been demonstrating is that successively that tradition has been weakened and weakened and weakened. And under the reign of Queen Elizabeth, that has basically disappeared. There is essentially nothing she can leave to her successors other than just the titular form of monarchy. And I'm not even confident in that at the moment. And then, of course, you realize that this has much broader implications. And we look at the Commonwealth, we look at, what does it mean? How can she, I mean, just looking at the futility of having the Queen as a head of state. Reagan, of course, invaded Grenada in the 1980s. Of course, Grenada was another Commonwealth realm. The notion that there is any sort of benefit to having, the Queen as your head of state is almost redundant. And of course, she is impotent in the face of, say, for example, the 1987 coup in Fiji, essentially. So, essentially, what does it matter if, the Commonwealth organization, is entirely paused? I think from my point of view, it is just yet another vehicle of globalization. And to me, nothing illustrates that better. If you look at this map, Mozambique and Rwanda are part of the Commonwealth now. And of course, Mozambique was a Portuguese colony, and Rwanda was, I believe, a Belgian colony.
Also, Cameroon was French.
And Cameroon, of course, yes, Cameroon, which is just southeast of Nigeria here, of course, was French. So we are not even we're not drawing a connection to monarchy, certainly, but we're not even drawing a connection to the historic ties of the former empire as some form of lingering element. We are now expanding into elements which previously had no association with the empire at all, and the question is why. And the question is essentially the Commonwealth is just a meaningless institution as it pertains to monarchy, as everything else we've demonstrated, except perhaps the exception with the Commonwealth and the British Empire is that in a way it represents the decline of the monarchy rather than all of these sacred traditions which we've illustrated. If we're representing the monarchy at its height, again, some people will chide me for my reactionary anti-imperialist views, but nevertheless, look at Elizabeth I and the particularist conception of a independent monarchy and compare that to, basically this is a day and night example of the particularism of the first Elizabeth and the globalization of the second Elizabeth. So, if she ultimately does support organizations such as Black Lives Matter, which we have been, again, through one of the Schrodinger's stances, that may or may not be true. We don't know whether that cat is alive or dead. Based on what we've tried to illustrate here, that wouldn't really surprise us, owing to the fact that she has this loyalty, again, not just to United Kingdom, but a loyalty to, again, constitutionally, to all of these nations. How essentially can one rule over, Jamaica? How can one rule over Antigua, Belize, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia? How can one be the representation of all of them at the same time without being representative of nothing, essentially? And I think that is sadly the lasting impression we have, is that she has capitulated on all fronts to the point that we simply have the form, we have the physical institution, we have the ceremony, we will probably have a series more jubilees before she dies. And that's it. After this, there is nothing, there is no more element to this. And of course, from an intellectual point of view, and as a Catholic, I'm drawn, of course, to Jacobitism. But even then, I think we're almost in a situation where monarchy, not just from this point of view, but monarchy as an institution is spent. There is another comparison which I've been avoiding, which I want to draw to, which is, what does one do when the monarch is basically politically impotent? And of course, as a former historian of Japan, I look to Japan during its long period under the rule of the various shogunates, whether it be the Kamakura, whether it be the Ashikaga, or whether it be the Edo shogunates. What did the empire, the emperor, really represent then? Well, there was, again, that sacred element, that particularistic element in the Japanese monarchy, which we have in the English monarchy. The Japanese monarch, as the expression of state Shinto, is basically supposed to be the descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, the notion of a land of the rising sun. Even despite
to quote Nazu Nitobe, he embodies the soul of Japan.
Yes, precisely. And this is, again, the physical embodiment of, I mean, even, post the American occupation, the title is of the symbol of the state, essentially. And what we're trying to argue, does Queen Elizabeth fill that role? And I think, we've demonstrated she has in the most superficial way possible. But with Japan, we're in an interesting situation. And of course, the emperor is still a priest in the conception that, a pontifical monarchy, essentially. And throughout this time of the, secular rule of the samurai, the monarch was, essentially kept to a very sort of close-knit court in Kyoto. He ruled through a series of, intricate ceremonies and institutions, like what we see under Viscount Isha. And of course, kept a series of, very connected bloodlines, such as the Fujiwara clan, around to maintain even court dynasties, as opposed to shogunal dynasties, etc. So despite the fact that the monarchy in Japan, the emperor, was irrelevant, essentially politically, for hundreds of years, what it did offer, again, I go back to de Maistre, which is de Maistre argued in the Pope, that what the Pope does is the Pope confers legitimacy, and that legitimacy is the basis of a sort of conservative political order. In Japan, the emperor during that period was that symbol of the nation and wasn't and officiated over the political system. He was not independent of the political system. He was essential to confer legitimacy upon another form of secular rule. And I would argue that the Queen follows a very similar pattern. However, whereas during the shogunal reign in Japan, the monarch and Japan itself was able to retain its institutions and its national character, often to the point, even at the point during the Edo period, that Japan was basically locked off from the rest of the world in order to preserve its culture. The Queen has instead offered this Demastrian legitimation of the forces which are basically the forces of negation, which will destroy and hollow out, and as Oran McIntyre will say, wear your cause as a skin suit. Essentially, progressivism will wear the monarchy as a skin suit, and as an unappetizing image, basically, that's the situation where I find myself in, which is
just like everything else that they do. They will always skin it and wear it as almost as a victory code.
Mm. So yes, Marcus, unless you have anything else to say on this cheery topic, we can get on to the super chats.
I have a couple of points because, as you know, I've mainly sort of let you, ride the main line of this, and I've sort of just come in on little tangents. But there's a couple of little things, if I may, just since we've got to the end here. I was going to mention this point, just when you mentioned Franz Josef initially, as in, maybe like 40 or 50 minutes ago, and it sort of pertained to this question about, what was Franz Josef ruling? This sort of multinational, multi-ethnic Austrian Empire, which then would become the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and seeing his role as this maintenance of a sacred sort of almost divine right, and that he himself as the sovereign, as the emperor, and being integrated with his role within the Catholic Church and being a representative of the Church to some degree within his empire, and the fact that he did his utmost to not bastardize that, and even though some might could criticize in hindsight that Franz Josef could have done this differently or that differently or whatever. Again, we've had streams on that, and this is not the stream about Franz Josef. But the point that I wanted to make here is that, without sort of getting too into the question of ethnogenesis, is that what has been lost in this imperial British discussion, and it's a very verboten place to go with this in mainstream discussion, is there's almost been on one hand there's been an amnesia of this, and then inversely there's also been an intentional confusion of this, or an intentional conflation of these ideas that, where does England sit within Britain? What is the difference between a Briton and the nation of Britain? What is the difference between Britain and the British Empire? These things, and what is it to be a citizen of the British Empire but not to actually be ethnically British? I mean, these things are all questions which deserve to be thrashed out in an honest and a forthright discussion. But within the constraints of modernity and for ideological necessity, those can't be spoken about, and they can't be
within the context of modernity, Marcus. Our solution to that, kind of like at the beginning, was almost implied by my notion of the entirely imported Republican conception of what it means to be a Commonwealth citizen, is that notion has been employed on Britain, and as a result, our conception, what Britain was just a geographic entity with implications going back to antiquity, essentially, and what it became, all it meant was representing a personal union between the kingdoms of Scotland and England, both of which were two nations with their own major culture. And of course, Wales was then part of England as the principality. However, we have now recontextualized that very specific, very clear meaning as a result of this imperial connection, I would argue, has facilitated that even further, adopted an American conception of what it means to be British. And again, this combine that with the abolition of Britain, all of these points just compound the fact that, as with the Queen representing the absence of any animating feature to resonate in that tradition of the actual court and the rituals and the ceremonies, our culture too is being hollowed out and decayed and being essentially brought into the American sphere. So, but there's also, I think I have to mention this regarding Franz Josef, because I start off saying, qui tace consentia videtur ubi loqui debuit ac potuit. He who is silent, taken to agree, he ought to have spoken when he was able to. Franz Josef represented the antithesis of this. As he was, toying with elements of constitutionalism throughout his reign, my favorite saying of his was, "My solemn duty is to protect my people against their governments." Could you find a more polar opposite conception of what it means to be a monarch than what Queen Elizabeth does, which is, my essential role is to acquiesce to whatever my governments do, despite my oath to the contrary, essentially.
She's lived the life of the inverse of what Franz Josef swore to, in essence.
Yes, precisely, which is why I sort of bring up those comparisons, because I think, Iron Tory has been saying, due to the length of the period between them, it's not necessarily a fair comparison. But I do think there is an element of a comparative study which is warranted, I think. But we really need to get onto the super chats.
Can I just speed run my last things without even if we don't engage in discussion?
Yeah, sure.
One is that, and I'll be very brief on this, and I'll be as vanilla as I can, because I know it can be slightly contentious. But when we consider the forces that have driven modernity in our modern age, and by that I mean sort of this side of the last sort of century and a half, possibly post-Napoleonic, to what degree have we seen you mentioned the Fall of Eagles video that we did a little while ago, and we discussed in brief the series that was inspired by, and the story that series covers. What is it that permitted, or what is it that sort of led to the near destruction of the Romanovs, the disempowerment of the Hohenzollerns, who were all sort of related, obviously, to the House of Windsor, to the House of Saxe-Coburg, but the Windsors hung on when all these other adversarial monarchs were either disempowered, as in the context of great powers, and then these other nations which had monarchies, such as Denmark, as Sweden, etc., Belgium and the Netherlands, have sort of been made an irrelevancy, and yet the Windsors have maintained this sort of pseudo prominence, almost sort of built upon this, almost like a zeppelin or a hot air balloon. Like it's larger, but it's built on nothing. And to what degree, or what sort of, I don't want to really say the words, but almost if what agreement was made between these people and the drivers of modernity that we ended up at this juncture, is what I'm saying.
I think I'm probably less conspiratorial than you. I think, you mentioned
okay. I'm delving into conspiracy, I know, but I'm just.
No, I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean, I don't think necessarily there was a pact. I think it's due to two rather banal factors. I mean, obviously, you mentioned the monarchy of the Netherlands, Belgium. We could also talk about Norway, which is a stream on its own, really worth. Denmark, Spain, of course. All of these monarchs have transitioned into that presidential ceremonial position in one form or another. I'd say Japan is still a special case, but when it comes to our monarchy, I think it's simply its prominence and its position in popular culture. I think it is owed to the preeminence of Britain and the empire, and the fact that the Queen is leading so many nations, but also due to the dominance of American culture throughout the world, and how the American public in particular has a fascination with our monarch, who just so happens to speak English. I don't think it's anything necessarily grander than that in terms of why the Queen has a necessarily inflated sense of preeminence.
Indeed. And the very last point I just want to make is a personal one, and it's kind of in light of the stuff that ING's been saying throughout the stream. And that is that, and I'm sure it's true for you also, because I mean, you are British, you are English, and obviously this has a place in your heart as a monarchist, and for me too, this might sound strange, coming from a colonial, but also for those who do, follow this channel, your work, know that my background is Italian. Is sort of how I ended up on your Roman streams initially. because it's also my background of study, and that, you know, when a person moves from one country to another, if you are a traditionalist in a sense, you move knowing that that place you're going to has traditions of its own, has customs and mores which belong to it. And if you accept that way of life, you have no right to usurp it or to subvert it. And as my family were as Italian monarchists, right? And I mean, I say this as my grandfather, who actually fought against the English in North Africa, right, in the Second World War. When we were given the opportunity to come to Australia, and like I did say on AA Stream when I spoke about Australia, my family and many in our community, and that's Italian Australians, have been very grateful to come here. We've integrated very well into Australia. We've adopted Australian culture and mores very, very well. And the vast majority of us are extremely grateful for what Australia has done for us and where we've come. And the point I've always made to my fellow Italian Australians is that we came to Australia as a part of the Commonwealth, and this is a nation that adheres to a monarchy, and we have no right to subvert it. Us being Republicans is essentially an act of subversion, and we don't have the right to do that. And if those of us who came from Italian monarchist families, we would be doubly shamed to be Republicans on that basis, because we'd be subverting another nation's sovereign, and that is not right. So I've always had that position as someone who has had traditionalist leanings as an individual, yeah? And so for me to come to this standpoint in only recent times as, well, I am a monarchist, but I cannot fathom the House of Windsor anymore. It's a very painful place to be. It's not like I arrived at this yesterday on a whim. It has taken an awful lot of soul searching and an awful lot of reading and reflection and personal intellectual analysis to get to this standpoint of actually seeing this royal family for what it is. And yes, there are reasonings. Yes, there's mitigating circumstances. Yes, we can understand that. But ultimately, and we've basically canvassed this across the scope of this stream, that a family of royals has, and those who take the throne, who then take an oath, have obligations. And frankly, if you're not fit to take those obligations on, then you ought to not be a monarch. But sadly, we live in a world where people want to have their cake and eat it as well. And it's a very sad state of affairs, but sadly, it is where it is. And Iron Duke, just on your last comment, not your last comment, but one comment I did see, I appreciate that you also took an oath. And if you took an oath as a soldier, I and I'm sure Apostolic does too, absolutely respects you for that. And we can understand that your position is difficult. But please understand that we are a monarchist-friendly stream, and we haven't arrived at our conclusions on a whim either.
Thank you very much for that, Marcus. That was very important and needed to be said. Before coming on, I mentioned a little ditty from the Restorationist days after the French Revolution, after Napoleon was deposed. Plus royaliste que le roi, to be more royalist than the king. And I think that's an unfortunate position we're in, albeit probably at a much more profound degree than those such as de Maistre were feeling back in the 1820s. Nevertheless, this is the situation we find ourselves in. That leads us down interesting routes like into Jacobitism and things such as that. But anyway, thank you very much for that again, Marcus. And I'll finally move on to the super chats if YouTube will actually refresh the page so I can look at them. Here we are. Judge Caligula Bushman for €5. Thank you very much. It's hard to be a monarchist witnessing the modern dynasties. Then again, princes are people just as susceptible to the vices of modernity like us all. Yes, and I think that's important to mention. I mean, the Queen in particular, you have to remember that, again, the Royal House of Windsor, the Royal House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, the Royal House of Hanover, unlike the Stuarts or the Tudors, have been rather dull people, rather unimaginative. And a lot of the culpability, of course, because in a constitutional monarchy, you do things via your Privy Council. You do things, you act on advice of your council. It's not just a failure of the dynasty, but it's a failure of monarchism. It's a failure of monarchists in this country to uphold and remain true to the values. And of course, when you're threatened by the seemingly omnipotence of a hostile world, you're basically left in two positions, either appease or fight. And often, as we've seen with virtually the vast majority of our institutions, it has been easier simply to submit than fight. And that's the unfortunate situation we're in. Narco-Republican for €5. sorry, $5. Been right in the tiger. Now I can't wait to figure out what terrible atrocity has caused AM to indulge in rank punditry. Well, this wasn't quite rank punditry. I mean, this is our first stream about a living figure. And of course, its proximity to recent events almost lends itself to the position of being rank punditry. But I think we've been at pains, Marcus, to make this as historically focused as possible, even if we're pertaining to a figure which has an actual bearing on current events. Time Stealer for £5. Finally managed to catch a Pasta Posse stream live. I might be asleep by the time you read this, though. Here's shekels for all the quality content. Well, thank you very much, Time Stealer. We're not quite the posse, however. You know, this of course is just a heterodox stream. We only ever have one guest on a heterodox stream, and you know, Columba will be on with us, the full posse, back on Monday, and we'll be talking about the rise of the Habsburgs. If you want to watch the full posse live, John Gordon for
this is a partial posse.
Yes, this is the partial posse. Thank you, thank you from the Aussie. You're the Pasta Aussie, aren't you? I can't quite remember.
Yeah, that's what AA has blessed me as. So yes, I'll take it.
All because he couldn't pronounce apostolic anyway. John Gordon for $4.99. Thank you very much. I just wanted to thank you guys for staying up at this late hour to give us content. Well, it's very early in Australia for Marcus. And no, the only reason it was so late, it was going to be earlier, but it was, I think, very important for, you know, because Semiagog was hosting a very interesting stream earlier about Christian and being on basically, you know, the forces for tradition, so to speak. And I didn't want to clash with him, so I was very happy to lay the stream. And of course, it's, you know, a weekend, so I don't mind going that extra bit late. Lady of Shalott for £4.49. Thank you very much. Imagine being crowned monarch of what had recently been the greatest ever empire, then tacitly allowing it to be pissed away over the next 70 years. Well, I mean, the point is, a lot of the damage had already been done, and when she inherited the empire, it had already transitioned into the Commonwealth, and Britain had already lost its political preeminence due to 2 world wars, and the Americanization of the British Empire, you know, the surrender of military bases. We had already lost our military preeminence, our economic preeminence, and I would argue ultimately our cultural preeminence to the Americans. And that was simply what the Suez Crisis, which of course was the main sort of disastrous event at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, represents, is not, you know, her inheriting this grand legacy and pissing it away. Rather, it represents all of the disastrous decisions before then. And that was simply a reflection of Britain's declining role in the world and ever diminishing role ever since.
If I may just quickly, just on that time period, the Suez Canal, and we didn't actually mention it, something that's worth mentioning, in fact, is the decommissioning of the HMS Vanguard, Britain's last battleship, which didn't actually see combat. It was actually, I think, commissioned in 1946 after the war had ended. But it was scrapped on the basis that they couldn't afford the upkeep of the ship. And if you look at what Britain's public expenditure has been in the last 40 years, it's like, well, you couldn't afford to upkeep a battleship, but you've managed to, like, you know, quintuple the size of the NHS. Where's your priorities? Mm-hmm. But anyway, that's neither here nor there.
Anyway, who are we on tonight? Okay, John Boy for €10. Thank you very much. Great stream, but my insomnia has run out. Going to catch the rest tomorrow. Maybe you could have a Q&A on this sort of gentle hour. To be honest, it was such a depressing topic. I mean, a little bit of like hidden history on this. I was actually thinking of making this my first ever scripted video, but then I left it and went away, and I was motivated by the recent ridiculous comment about climate inaction, that rather than, you know, waste time doing a scripted video, I saw Marcus's animation and just came on and decided, yeah, we'll do it, and we'll do it now.
Just spitting tweets on the topic, and we ended up here.
Yeah, so this is, we're both in a rather sort of particular mindset, and I think having almost like therapy, having gotten all of this out, it's a subject I don't really want to return to, if that's all right, John Boy. But thank you nevertheless for the
as the comment says, we'll do it live.
Yes, pretty much. Jedi Knight Anakin Quintalker for $5. Thank you very much. I sometimes wonder what the Commonwealth will become post-collapse. I can imagine some sort of HRE-esque abomination in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, if only. If only it was something as interesting as a Holy Roman Empire-esque abomination in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. What we've demonstrated about the Commonwealth is that as an institution, it's far more banal than that, kind of like everything we've been illustrating about the monarchy. If anything, it's just like a second United Nations with no sort of real monarchical aspect other than the fact that the officiator has to be the monarch, or it doesn't even have to be the monarch. The effect essentially, Charles was appointed the heir to the Commonwealth as a courtesy. There is nothing even hereditary in the institution, so you could just give it as some form of rotational offering, like the European presidency to members of the Commonwealth. Why even bother having the monarch? Get rid of that last element of connectivity, which was founded back in the 1940s. Chris Raposo for $5 Canadian. Thank you very much. Terrific stream. You two learned a lot to think about. Is there a way to save our Commonwealth or crown? Well, I think the Commonwealth was a lost cause to begin with. Regarding crown, I mean, like I have been intimating, there is a sacerdotal element in the monarchy. Even if it's, basically the embers have gone out, it's still there. It's something which is unique to our system compared to any other European monarchy. And it's something which I still respect, even though I'm in a position where I'm incredibly frustrated that it is basically laying dormant, inanimate. I don't believe there's any future with the House of Windsor based on the prospects of all the royals which you've elucidated here. The future would have to be with another dynasty to me. However, even though I espouse Jacobitism, I'm very, very skeptical about the actual efficacy of that as a political position, sadly.
You don't think we can dig up a Stuart apostolic?
We can dig up a Stuart, but it's whether they'll be willing and able to take on this mess is my
Indeed.
concern.
Yes, quite.
If that were the case, then my Jacobitism would be less abstract and more direct, but sadly that is not the case, especially when the current Stuart claimant is, I believe, in his 80s. White Raven 7278 for $20. Thank you very much. That's very generous, White Raven. This stream has been great. Look into what exactly my so-called monarch has been up to. She is on my money, but I've never heard her or even gotten involved in politics or our current debt enslavement by China. Oh, well, I'm guessing that's another Aussie, or maybe this is another country. Maybe it's New Zealand, which has been enslaved by Chinese debt. But there you go. I mean, regarding the money aspect of the Queen, I mean, it's always an issue which has been brought up, often by Republicans, and again, it's testament to the substance of our conversations that when we talk about the monarchy, our arguments are reduced to, well, she costs about £40 million a year. That's nothing in the grand scheme. I mean, the NHS app unironically cost 1,000 times more than that and was a failure. It's just nothing. I mean, I don't care.
But apostolic, it's our, well, not our, but it's your NHS.
Oh yes. Oh yes. I mean, but that's the thing. I mean, the fundamental paradox of this system is that we as monarchists are coming at this from the point of view of what is a monarch supposed to represent. Well, of course, you can't have a democratic monarchy. It's a contradiction in terms. Either you believe that all people are equal, which is the fundamental, the idea of a government by the demos, by the people, or you do not, and you're a monarchist. So again, it's just a contradiction in terms, and this constant tokenism we've been elucidating as regards to egalitarianism and the monarchy. It's just superficial, and as we've demonstrated, it's part of a longer process of capitulation.
And also, to what degree also you want to delve into the notion of the demos, because in the end, if you look at the people who created the concept of demoskratia, that is the ancient Athenians, the Athenians themselves weren't exactly egalitarians either. I mean, there were many of non-citizens who were resident in Athens who were not representative of the assembly either.
Yes. Well,
And
I think,
they made distinctions, but I mean, the modern Republicans tend to overlook that. That's all I'll say.
no, it's fair. I mean, my first sort of major foray into obviously coming at this from a somewhat constitutional historian is that democracy is a lie. That's not a conspiracy. That's a fact. When you look at the original conception of democracy, it wasn't universal in the conception that we see universal suffrage. It was the demos were a particular group of people, and when we're ascribing democracy in the modern sense, we're adding these egalitarian aspects, which were the legacy of the French Revolution. And so, what we're talking about is like an Athenian concept which has been grafted on to a post-French Revolution conception of liberté, égalité, fraternité. And of course, the paradox of having these consciously Republican styles of government officiated over by monarchs who, again, just the absurdity of a progressive monarchy, but that's where we are. So unless you have anything else you want to say, Marcus, we can get out of here.
Just one last thing, just because it stood out to me. Brian Boru said something. Oh no, hang on, where are we? Yeah, about Charles wants to be the to be defender of faiths, rather than the defender of the faith, and that's just one last sort of nail in the coffin of the Windsors. Just how can I say, sort of scraping for relevancy in this modern world. It's pitiful that, I mean, we're both Catholics, so we both have our opinions on Protestantism. But at the very least, if you're going to be the head of the Church of England, at least do it authentically and not make a hash of it, But here we are.
To be honest, that sounds so stupid. I actually can't believe it. I'm going to have to look that up after this, because the idea, I mean, even ontologically, of having defender of the faiths, which are intrinsically opposite. I mean, sorry, English Loyalist, did you send us
that? Actually, I just caught that. Well, good you saw that.
Oh, my goodness, we've had more super chats. Thank you, English Loyalist, for $20. Thank you very much, English Loyalist. I'm very grateful that you reminded me. Very good stream again. For a simple Navajo as myself, my love for the English people should be unfathomable. Monarchs come and go. I put my faith in you, the people of England who care for the empire. Well, thank you. I mean, it is a weird sort of situation where ordinary plebs such as myself, and I can't speak to Marcus's obviously sort of potentially aristocratic lineage, where we who have no stake, who have nothing really to gain, are just monarchists by inclination, and are holding up and trying to conceptualize a system of monarchy which is functional, but of course it doesn't matter. Our opinions don't matter. The stream isn't going to change anything, which is a shame. But thank you, nevertheless, English Loyalist, for that super chat. Belle Forsome Knight for $2. Thank you very much. I think the next move of the monarchy is like Japan. What do you mean by that, Belle Forsome Knight? As in, I can't quite. Can you understand that, Marcus?
I don't know what it pertains to. Ultimately, to some degree, I think the Japanese emperor is sort of more an embodiment of the Japanese people than what the English monarchy is at this point, the British monarchy is. So I don't really know where he's going with that, to be honest. If he can elaborate before we end the stream, then we'll address it. But I don't really know the angle.
Well, just to talk about the Japanese monarchy, I mean, there are many aspects to it which obviously are advantageous over our own monarchy. One is that they have retained strict morganatic marriage and abandoned all notion of egalitarianism. So the rules of succession are very clear, and even eschewing the various female contenders in the line who are higher up in terms of their proximity to the emperor. And the fact that Japan has been able to retain that in some ways is a miracle. The fact, again, the emperor had of course, Akihito abdicated recently, and of course the new emperor officiated over a traditional Shinto ceremony, which is something I cannot in any confidence claim will happen over here. There are elements of the Japanese monarchy which have held on despite the physical conquest of the island, and even looking at its political system. When you look at someone like Shinzo Abe, he, in many ways, or rather Abe Shinzo, represents like an anomaly in the sense that he was a domineering prime minister. Traditionally, again, you just have almost you can say the Liberal Party is some sort of cameralist coterie around the emperor, and the emperor again radiates and provides some form of foundation to a system in which, you know, traditionally you would have a prime minister come in for a year, get involved in some sort of scandal, resign, and move on. Japan has a very different and unique political system, which again is worth its own stream, but very different, I would say, to the English monarchy. But yes, we really do need to. I need to go to bed. It's nearly 3 o'clock. So thank you to my wonderful patrons, and thank you to the many super chats. Thank you, Marcus, for coming on at such short notice.
You're welcome.
And unless you have anything to say, good night. Thank you all for watching. And
Indeed. Thank everyone.
And I will see you on Monday for the rise of the Habsburgs with Columba.
Take care, everyone. Good night.